I am on the clock in 0 drafts right now. It's a disaster. I only have 2 drafts remaining. They all closed out pretty quickly over the weekend and in these last couple of days. Those drafts are on the late rounds, but I'm not on the clock in either of them. We are going to look at my exposures a little bit today. I promised that last week and couldn't figure it out. I just got it figured out this morning. We're going to talk a little ball, spin the wheel, talk about some teams. And very soon, about half an hour from now, we're going to welcome on one of my favorite analysts, Thinking About Thinking's Jakob Sanderson. We're going to talk with him, get some of his thoughts on best ball. He's been running some fantastic content about it this offseason, and then jump into a fast draft for the first time in the channel's history. This is Stealing Signals. Let's go. Welcome in, guys. Chat's fired up. You got, I'm going to jump into my Underdog account right away. You can see I got these 2 drafts finishing up, a couple puppies. This one that I double starred that I really like, we could look at. So it was a Josh Allen, Brock Purdy build. I just took Drew Lock on the last turn because I only had Allen and Purdy. It's a Malik Neighbors team. And I'm going through my projections right now, and I'm starting to like Trey Sermon as especially in these 20-round drafts as a really late pick. So he was a bring back option. I'm trying to build out a little Giants Colts bring back thing late. I took Khalif Raymond at that turn as well because I have the Niners thing here, Purdy and Kittle. But it's just a really fun receiver build. I have, in addition to having Josh Allen and Purdy, I have Garrett Wilson, Malik Neighbors, Stefon Diggs, Jordan Addison, Dunze. I have both Kittle and Kincaid. Oh, and then I think the reason I started was I went real 0 RB, and I still, at the 10-11 turn in the Superflex, got James Conner and Raheem Mostert. And you don't really feel like you're giving up a ton of projected points when you get those guys as your top 2 running backs. Got Zach Charbonnet, Kendre Miller, Kamani Vidal, and Ray Davis. I just went 6 straight backs after the 0 RB start out of the 1 hole. So that seems fun. That's why it's got some stars on it. I like how that build's come together. This is one that I didn't like. I've renamed 3773, probably like reminding myself the build structure. This one just finished up. We could look at this one too. I liked this one as well. It became a Cousins, Geno, Knicks build. It's one of the few where I didn't take a QB in the first couple of rounds. I waited on Cousins, but because this room was friendly enough, I got a decent price on Cousins, a decent price on Geno Smith. Some rooms you can get box out of QB, but I got to start with a Bijan Tyreek build that also has Devontae Adams at that 3-4 turn where I took Cousins. Having both Bijan and Tyreek, I think Bijan could have that massive ceiling. We've talked about that on the stream. On other episodes, I think Tyreek Hill could be the wide receiver 1 by a lot if he really hits. Although, as I start to go through my projections, I am seeing the CeeDee Lamb cases. I've come around quite a bit on that. My projections actually have Lamb ahead of Hill for a couple of reasons. One of the big ones is a note that Sean pointed out to me when I pushed him on Lamb versus Hill a while back on Stealing Bananas, that Lamb ran a lot more routes last year and probably will again. And when you get through the projections, that's how it looks. Miami's not a super high volume team. They're going to be a little bit more run heavy. You get a pace and a pass rate bump on Dallas relative. And Lamb runs around on like every drop back, and Tyreek sometimes is a little less. He'll come off the field a little bit. They'll do some different formational things. And so the routes gap can be massive. The drop backs gap and the routes per drop back are both edging Lamb's way. So Tyreek has these massive targets per route run and per route numbers that look amazing. His efficiency is better than Lamb's as well in terms of like yards per target, TD rates and stuff. You look at his career, you look at the multiple year stuff, you're like, man, projecting him on a per route basis is like he's massive. Fantasy points per route, however you want to look at it. But the routes difference is very, very meaningful. So that one of those projections-based things. that has been fun to start to see formulate as I'm about halfway through my projections. I talked with Siegel about some of my early projection stuff on stealing bananas this week. Those episodes are going to be rolling out through the next week. More importantly, you guys always want to know when the Leone projection pods are coming. Our first episodes are going to be recorded today. So I keep getting DMs about this on Twitter. He and I are going to record the first 2 divisions today. Then I'm going on vacation next week. You guys will miss me next Wednesday. Important scheduling note there for Stealing Signals. Another important scheduling note for Ship Chasing fans. We have the 4th of July tomorrow. We're not going to be around tomorrow either at Ship Chasing. So you won't see me on these live streams for a little while. I'm going to a lake house with my wife's family. It's going to be a lot of fun with the kids, swimming in the lake, this, that, and the other thing, playing some golf with my brother-in-law. But won't be able to hop on next week. That's part of why I haven't made it a massive priority to go get into more slows, as I kind of want to just enjoy a little vacation here. The timing has lined up. 2 weeks from today, I will be back here, and I almost certainly will have more slows entered by then. I don't know when I'll do it or how I will do it, but I need to make a trip down to Oregon, get into a bunch of drafts. I mean, I might even do it before I go on this trip just to have something to do on the trip as well and be working through some of those builds. I'm not entirely sure, but I need to restock the backlog of drafts, start getting some more drafts in. I already feel like I am missing out here. What about Lamb's holdout and Dak's forever injuries? I'm worried about Dallas this year. I think Lamb gets paid. I don't think there's really any way around that for Dallas. If he's serious about holding out, I mean, Dallas' season is just done before it starts. They have no one else who can earn volume. I'm not taking. It's probably not right, but I ascribe different degrees of concern to different holdouts and things. And I'm also not, stressed about Dak's injury history. There's a lot of players we could talk about with injury history stuff where I'm typically going to be a little bit of an injury optimist, which is maybe wrong, but willing to do that. I'm just thinking Aaron Rodgers and Kirk Cousins are 2 that are both coming back from Achilles and could be awful this year. And I'm in on Garrett Wilson. I'm in on Atlanta's offense. I'm banking a lot on those guys actually being able to stand in the pocket and throw. So definitely with Dak, who's healthy right now, but has had some injury issues, I think that this is alluding to. I'm not going to discount anything or worry too much. Those things can pop back up, but that happens. But as far as Lamb's holdout, I was kind of getting to a point where I was going to say that I have different degrees of concern depending on the player and the situation. And in Lamb's case, he's the guy that I want exposure to. GM to you guys. Ashton's excited. He says he loves these podcasts. Excited to have you guys. We got Utah Sports in here promoting other streams, letting everyone know that ETR and Spags are live. So if you don't enjoy my content, you should go watch them. Nah, he's saying the best place to be is here. I appreciate that. The viewer numbers start to dip. People start running for the hills. One thing I wanted to talk about at the top here was last week when I spun the wheel, I got the Packers. And for those of you, and I say this every episode, most of you guys are probably return viewers. But for those who don't know, I spin the wheel, land on a team, talk about my expectations for that team for this year. Those are going to get more fun too, because I'm starting to do my projections when I have more fleshed out ideas. I did my Packers projection since last week, and really just in the day after we got the Packers and I was kind of struggling to articulate what I thought about them. And it was because the whole time in the back of my head, I was like, I had a really good take about the Packers. They're actually one of the teams I thought through when I came up with this idea for the wheel. And I was like, oh man, they'd be a really fun team to land on. But that was months ago. And then by the time I landed on them, I was like, what was that take that I couldn't come up with in real time last week? And it's one of those things where you got to think through the situations. And sometimes you get to a take. You're like, that's how I believe the situation plays out. I feel good about that, but I couldn't pull it forward. So I want to mention it here at the top of this episode. And it's essentially, I ended up mentioning on Ship Chasing last week and somewhere else as well that I was on a guest spot or something. But it's essentially that I think the Packers, if you're in on Jordan Love, that they're like a team. It was when I was on with Neil Orfield as well. But yeah, if you are in on Jordan Love, if you draft Jordan Love, I think you can throw in basically all the Packers pass catchers onto those types of builds. And I think that makes a lot of sense in the underdog sort of one-off structure where you could, like we always talk about, like, oh, it could be one guy one week and one guy the next week and help you get through and have the right combination of that offense where like other people might not get through that only have a skinny stack, like a Jordan Love, Christian Watson. But Christian Watson's only good 1 week and the other week you needed, Dobbs or whoever it is, Jaden Reed. And the take is essentially that I think this passing game and these receivers are going to be that whole idea of better and best ball that I think Hayden Winks has coined. I think we're going to see spikes from these guys throughout the year, and it's going to be somewhat inconsistent. Reed's definitely going to be the most consistent. That's why he's going the highest. This is pretty much what the market is telling us. It's maybe not the most novel concept, but I do think these guys are going to be a lot more of a headache in managed leagues and season log leagues. And I've expressed a little bit of skepticism about the market's buy-in on the whole passing game. I talked about that a little bit last week, just that there's a little concern for me. I'm still into it. And then also on Jaden Reed being the clear number one, who in particular, my Stealing Bananas co-host Sean Siegel has been very, very in on Jaden Reed, has called him one of the most undervalued players and thinks this is a guy who, look, had a really efficient rookie year and is primed to take a step forward in year two. And there's a lot of reasons to be really in on him. And I get that mentality. But I guess I've talked about this. I talked about this last week. I worry about his role expanding. I think it was more of like a high floor situation for him last year. And then as the outside receivers do more this year, because those guys have a little bit more difficulty in their role and the technical elements of their role. The whole receiving core is young. We talked about all this last week in the last episode of Stealing Signals, but I just wanted to come back to this idea that I do think you're going to get some splashes from the outside guys, assuming that the offense is good and the passing game is good. And I think it will be fine. It's going to have games for sure that are positive. I'm just not really buying into the full, like, if you ask Packers fans, Love deserves to be in a tier with CJ Stroud. And in some respects, his numbers look better than Stroud's. And so there's a lot of, look at what the numbers were, especially when you do the second half of the season isolated for Love. If he picks up where he left off there, statistically speaking, he's going to look like that. I think there's a pretty big gap there, at least where I'm at right now. And when I say a big gap, I don't mean in ceiling, because I think Love can be as good as Stroud. I think he showed that last year. I think there's a big gap in my comfort of the floor for these two players going forward. I think CJ Stroud's going to be a star, and I'm worried that Love's going to plateau at a little, like I talked through this last week, but I don't think he's going to be bad. I think he's going to be a good, competent quarterback at the NFL level, but I'm worried that he's going to be like a Kirk Cousins or something long-term, like a good, but not great pocket passing quarterback. But that can still be good for the pass catchers, et cetera. And I think the scheme and Matt LaFleur is going to elevate. That's part of the reason I'm concerned, is I think Matt LaFleur elevates and already has elevated, did a great job as a coach last year. I made the comparison to Sean McVay and Jared Goff when McVay elevated Goff, and Goff had these incredible numbers for a stretch. And then it was like, well, but actually Goff is not being additive to the scheme. And we actually need to trade him and go get Matthew Stafford, who's going to make the scheme better. He's going to be additive to what we're trying to do. He's going to elevate. I don't think there's a scale here. I don't think Love is that where McVay thought Goff was, because it's funny. Even Goff goes over to Detroit and he fits better, right? Like, he's been probably additive there to what they're trying to do, what Ben Johnson's trying to do with the Lions. But it is fascinating that for McVay, getting Stafford did unlock things. They go on, they win a Super Bowl the next year. Statistically speaking, they get to even some larger peaks, especially, with what Cooper Kupp was able to do. They're able to get the ball to the guy they want because they're able to win on the matchups that they want to dictate, rather than having to, hurry up to the line of scrimmage and McVay's telling Goff, this is what the defense is doing and where I want you to go. Remember, that was the whole story with Goff early in his career. Probably not entirely fair, that story to Jared Goff, but it talks, it speaks to this idea of not being able to dictate what you want to do to the defense, but having to kind of read what the defense is giving you. And then eventually when the defense starts to disguise things post-snap, Goff wasn't able to make some adjustments, or this is the story. McVay goes and gets Matthew Stafford, and he's able to do some different things. Excuse me. and sort of dictate where he wants the ball to go and all that. So again, it's a sliding scale. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen to Jordan Love, but I talked to this last week. I'm a little worried about how much he's at an elevator of talent. We'll see. There's certainly ceiling there, and there's smarter people than me that are already buying into that ceiling. Speaking of smarter people than me, I will mention those of you who really enjoy this type of talk. I got an awesome opportunity to jump on the Athletic Football Show with Robert Mays yesterday, recorded about 90 minutes. The conceit that he sent me was the 10 commandments of fantasy football in 2024. So I went through the 10 things that I thought were most important. So like the first 4 or 5 were more long-term important things that matter for fantasy football. The last 5 or so were like specific trends for 2024. Really, really fun conversation with him. And again, the goal of the show was to basically break down everything that matters for fantasy football. So make sure you listen to that one. That'll be a lot of fun. A big part of it was talking through how these different teams are different, and you need to know the unique elements of each offense and the types of range of outcomes and probability-based thinking that is different for all 32 teams. And that's why I go so in depth on the specific situations when we get into these teams. And once you listen to that other podcast with Robert Mays, you'll totally understand why I brought it up right now when I was talking about this nuance to Jordan Love's profile. That's the whole game to me right now. And me and Robert talked a lot about that. So where the edges are and how that particular thing is where the edges are. Really was happy with how that show came out. Robert's an incredible football mind, and a really fun person to talk to about this stuff. He and I have developed a little bit of a relationship because we tend to think about that kind of stuff similarly. He plays a little fantasy and seems to like my approach to fantasy. And so we've had a lot of fun talking about that stuff. So check that one out. And then, here in a little bit, we're going to have Jakob Sanderson on, and we're going to talk with him and then do a live draft right here on Stealing Signals. Very excited for that. We got Long Boy Frank says Packers had like 5 different wide receiver 1 weeks last year. I think he means 5 different players had wide receiver 1 weeks for the team. They're deep. Jordan doesn't seem to key on anyone in particular. He could throw 40-plus TDs without anyone really being the alpha. That's exactly right. That's what I'm trying to say. Is I think this is a team that makes sense to overstack in best ball, because you're going to get spike weeks. You're going to get matchup based. Oh, hey, Christian Watson went off this week. Next week it is Jaden Reed, etc. I'm worried that Diggs will try to fight Stroud when his target share dips. I think Diggs is going to be on his best behavior, man. He was his first year in Buffalo, and then he got mad. He got his contract restructured to a 1-year deal, which he wanted. It was reported that it wasn't just what the Texans wanted, but also he wanted to go hit free agency again. I think he's going to be on his absolute best behavior. He strikes me as the kind of guy, Diggs has his personality stuff. He's a little bit of, narcissistic kind of guy, right? But I do think he's the kind of guy that gets in line when he needs to. Like, this is one of the reasons I'm actually really in on Diggs this year. And I think people are crazy who are like, you can take Tank Dell straight up over Diggs. Like, Diggs has been a better volume earner for his whole career. And we talked about this when we did the Texans one. Like, it took Nico some time to build up too. Nico was so good last year that I'm definitely willing to put Nico ahead of Diggs. But Tank has an injury-shortened rookie season, and you're going to say he's definitely better than Stefon Diggs, who's earned volume at every stop of his career and is going to be motivated this year. I get this concern. There's a little bit of risk here, and we do need to consider these types of risks. Like, I don't think it's being baked into Brandon Ayuk enough. Brandon Ayuk seems pissed. Although, I mean, maybe that will blow over, but there's some chance that, like, Kyle Shanahan's put him in the doghouse before. There's been issues with Brandon Ayuk before. But as far as Diggs is concerned, I think he's going to be on his absolute best behavior this year, actually. And I think it's a great chance for them to win. They're in a good spot. I think he's going to be team player, rah-rah guy. That's just my personal read on it, and the way he works and the way he kind of ticks. This offseason, they've been like, I've not heard a thing at it, Stefon Diggs, since the trade, but I've seen videos of how hard he's working out, right? Like, that's the message he's conveying this year. There's no cryptic anything from him. So Morning, Mr. Popinski. What is up, everybody? This is ADP chasing. You're referencing. Put Bo Milton on there. Might be Puka list along with Javon Baker and Brennan Rice. Any thoughts? I don't think the fits are the same. But Bo Melton, I guess, could make sense if all the other receivers just aren't. I mean, we don't have like an alpha in Green Bay, which is part of the point. I've said a number of times that I think the Cowboys are the closest situation in that, like, if Lamb isn't there, you have no one else who can really earn targets, and there's this opportunity like Puka stepped into. It depends on how you're defining what Puka is, because like I think a Puka is being able to come in and earn 160 targets as a rookie. That's the thing. That's why I keep saying it's not going to happen again. But if you're just talking about a rookie hit, yeah, like Javon Baker makes sense. That's a pretty ambiguous passing game. I know they were kind of doing the ambiguous passing games. Depends on how you're defining, like, might be Puka, right? But like, yeah, sure. A rookie in New England could easily be the breakout in that passing game because it's open. And same thing with the Chargers, Brennan Rice. I don't suspect Brennan Rice has that in his bag. And the same with Javon Baker. The per route running target earning profile for Puka from college was so strong still relative to those guys. It's not like a useful point to say that there's probably not going to be a Puka, but there's probably not going to be a Puka. I don't want to get off on too many other tangents. This isn't really a tangent. Me Watt says I have such little interest in Diggs. I mean, I'm going to try to get you interested in him by August. Artillery Frost says Diggs seems like if the Texans are good, he'll be awesome. If the Texans are bad, well, the Texans were bad anyways. That's probably about what I would say. But I expect the Texans to be really good. They made some additions on defense that aren't being talked about enough. They added Diggs. It's Stroud's second season. He should take a step forward. They're in that rookie QB contract window where they're going to be good. They're going to win the AFC South, and that's a tough division this year. And I think they're going to compete for the number one overall seed in the AFC. I think they're going to be that good. So a couple other things I wanted to do before inviting Jakob on. First of all, one of the main reasons I'm kind of doing an introduction here at all, Jakob will be coming on soon, is I wanted to spin the wheel because we got the I like to, when I spin the wheel, I like to break down the. All right, we got the Miami Dolphins. I always forget that it's going to cut off my mic, so I get quiet. I like to break down the team a little bit. I didn't want to make Jakob sit through me doing like 10 minutes on a team or try to fit both of our thoughts on a team in because we're both a little bit long-winded. That would just be a disaster. So let me do Miami real quick. First of all, of course, we got to name some guys. Miami's a great team to have, though, because there's a lot of very quick and easy ways I think we can talk through it. But we got remember some guys from Miami. This is actually a really fun one. Wes Welker, early career Wes Welker. First name that came to my mind was Chris Chambers. You got the Ronnie Brown Wildcat with Ricky Williams. That year was incredible. Chris Chambers for Dylan as well. Oronde Gadsden. Oh my God, an all-time favorite of mine. This dude, if you have some time, go look up Oronde Gadsden with 2 Ds. Congrats to Benny. Shout out. Most people call him Gadsden or Gadsden. They don't get the second D in there. Love that you got his name right as well. Go watch his highlight, just like his one-handed catches. He's, if not the number one all-time one-handed catch receiver, he's top 3. I mean, he has a plethora of elite one-handed catches. So good. We got Einhorn and Finkel from Ace Ventura Pet Detective. We got Marty Booker on here. I think of him as a Chicago Bear. Brandon Marshall, another Chicago Bear, but also Dolphin. OJ McDuffie. Jay Ajayi. There's a name. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Oh, man. Jay Fiedler, Chad Pennington. They always had a whole bunch of different quarterbacks. Remember Tyler Thigpen? Played for them for a little bit. I think he was maybe a little better when he played for the Chiefs. I don't know if I'm being called a snowflake or if there is a player who goes by snowflake. I'm going to let you guys come up with remember some guys. There's some good ones here, but I want to get to Jacob. So first, I want to run through Miami really quick. One of the things I can do is I can go right to my projection sheet. This is the fun thing as we start to get further along. There's a whole bunch of stuff on the screen now. Bunch of data and stuff. Miami. I guess there's not really an easy way for me. Ultimately, it's this right side. These are my projections, the results for Miami. Tyreek Hill, massive projection, 353 PPR points. Devon Achane. One of the things that I found in digging into some of the numbers, let's go to a different doc, one of my lookup docs. If you go to Devon Achane's numbers, some of his advanced stuff last year, these numbers are elite. Missed tackles forced per touch, yards after contact per attempt over on the right side of the screen there. Very, very strong. His efficiency was through the roof. He averaged 7.4 yards per carry on just over 100 carries. He had 800 rushing yards on 103 carries. It's absurd. This target market share is actually not that high relative to, because this is for, I think, their whole season's worth of targets. Targets per game, 3.6 per game, was actually a pretty big number for Achane last year. And it reminded me of how they were intentionally trying to get the ball to him in the pass game. Schematically, there was a couple games in his game log. Achane's obviously a huge part of the conversation here for them. He can't do what he did last year probably from an efficiency standpoint, but you would expect more workload as part of the trade-off, right? Like you get more touches as the efficiency goes. There's the Raheem Mostert, elephant in the room. He's going at a place where a guy who scored 20 touchdowns last year is either a smash hit or is going to get injured, right? The market's saying that he's very fragile and is unlikely to do what he did last year or even play as much as he did last year, which opens up opportunity for Achane. So from a projection standpoint, I was just, clicking through the projections on Miami. Achane gets knocked two ways. He gets knocked because you can't really project 7 yards per carry. It's just like something that that's why a projection can be wrong and not helpful in some ways, because the outlier efficiency, we talk about, you're trying to find outliers, you're trying to find league winners, and you require efficiency to have league winning upside potential. This is something we're going to talk about with Jacob. His great piece recently talked about the point of seeking upside and what you're going for. Achane's a great example of a player where a projection is going to say he's undervalued or overvalued. He's going to come in a projection below because his ADP is factoring in the elite upside, the tail outcomes, the top 95th percentile outcomes where he's incredibly efficient. The yardage just absolutely stacks. There's enough work and enough volume overall that he's the stud. But yeah, this game log, you see early in the season, one target in his first game, barely played, only 6 snaps. 4 and 5 the next couple of weeks, only 1 in week 5. He only plays 26 snaps in that game, gets hurt, misses some time, comes back, plays only 3 snaps in this game, only 1 target. So even the targets per game thing, the point that I'm trying to drive home here, isn't all that helpful. If you look at the snap percentages here, I'm going to sort this by snap percentages and now go back to the target column. The first highest snap percentage game was week 18. He only had 1 target in that game. But in most of all these other games where he played at least, 39% or what have you, I can't actually pull those together. This is one of the things on Pro Football Reference. You can get these pop-ups to show you like the numbers in certain games, but not when you sort by columns. I always forget that. I was trying to have it do some math for me and tell me the average targets per game of the games where Achane actually played like 39% or more. And yeah, there's a couple 1-target games here, but look at that. Most all of them are 3+ targets. There's multiple 4s, multiple 5s. This one game here is a 9-target game. It was clear that it was their intention to really get him going in the passing game that week. I believe there was some talk about trying to get him going in the passing game. He actually had a really rough efficiency game there. Only catches 5 of the 9 passes for a 2.7 yards per target, 24 yards on 9 targets. That's not great. Obviously, not what we would expect for him overall because he's really talented. Every other game, not every single other game, but several other games he has decent numbers. The 5.3 total yards per target is probably below what he actually is when you look at the missed tackles forced per touch and you look at the yards after contact per attempt and the explosiveness in the run game. The average yards per target for running back about 6. So he's below average here. I would expect that he's at least 6, if not an above average efficiency type player as a receiver. And a lot of his volume, I mean, a third of his overall targets. Oh, no, sorry, not targets. He had 27 receptions, 37 targets. About a quarter of his overall targets came in that one Tennessee game that he wasn't very effective. The point is they were intentionally trying to get him the ball in the pass game. The point is also that his efficiency is a small sample and probably would be expected to be better. So I think the passing game is a really exciting element for Achane this year. We know the rushing efficiency, like he fit into the scheme. We know that the Dolphins overall do such an incredible job of getting the ball into the hands of their stars. That's the biggest rule about Miami. When I talk about Miami, we spun the wheel, we got Miami. I want to focus on the fact that they get the ball to the players that matter in their offense. We talked about this a little bit last week. There was a question about Jalen Waddle's contingent value vis-a-vis Brandon Ayuk's. And this is the point that I would drive home. You look at the targets last year, and Waddle plays 14 games. Tyreek Hill plays 16. These guys miss a combined 4 games. And there's no other player on the team who has more than 43 targets. There's no other player on the team who has more than 366 receiving yards, more than 35 receptions. For most teams, that's their 5th or 6th player in the passing game. Let's look at a team. The Chiefs? That's the last team they played. They were a little bit unconcentrated. Let's see how many players you have to go down to get to 366. Only 3, but they have multiple in the 300 to 200 range. They're not a good example. There's fewer than you would expect, but for most teams, you are talking about not this level of concentration, particularly when you talk about the yardage for Tyreek Hill and for Jalen Waddle being over 1,000 yards apiece. The Chiefs, part of that was just, didn't have massive yardage for their big guys either. Anyway, that obviously tilts me that I clicked on the Chiefs and it's not making the point that I want it to make. I'll point to the targets. There's 4 other guys that have 40 plus targets. And Justin Watson had 50 plus. There's 2 at 38. There's another at 32. So you have 7 more guys at 30 plus targets. You go to Miami. There's 4 other guys in the 30 range, but 43 is the next highest, 38, 37, 33. You can see how that's lower as you scale down. It's not the right comp. Click on literally any other team. The Bills are also hyper concentrated. But even they have 4 players above 600 yards. Their 5th player is at 445. We were just talking about the Dolphins' 3rd player is at like 300 total yards. The Bills had 3 players at 80 plus targets, but still had a couple more in the 45, 54 range. You guys get the point. I don't know why I'm trying to drive home this point. The Bills are just the next team I saw to click on, but it's a hyper concentrated passing game. There's been talk that they won't necessarily be exactly that way again. And I've seen people be really high on Jonnu. I've had people in the comments on Stealing Signals YouTube asking me about Jonnu. I called Jonnu Smith and Malik Washington undraftable at one point, and I had a long discussion with somebody in the comments about that. And there was some fair pushback, and yet I stand by the point because it's a range of outcomes based thing. Not only do you need those guys to hit and the trends to change, you need them to change a lot. That's the key. For those guys to be, because like 300 yards is not meaningful. I'm going back the year prior, and both Tyreek and Waddle played 17 games in this one, so that's notable. But the 3rd place guy was 417 yards. Gesicki had 362. Target-wise, both those guys just barely hit 50. You're typically talking about the 3rd guy in targets being up around 75 or 80 in almost every passing game. The year prior is not a Mike McDaniel year, but I'm going to click back to it just to show that Gesicki just the year prior had been a 112 target guy with 780 yards. Yes, they added Tyreek Hill, but also just the concentration element is the point that I'm trying to drive home. It's like, yeah, they add Tyreek Hill, but also Mike Gesicki becomes a complete afterthought in this offense and has like a 362-yard season. That's not fantasy relevant. 600 yards is where you get to like, okay, fine. Like that's probably fantasy relevant, but I'm often being like, you shouldn't be trying to draft players for 600-yard seasons. It's sort of like I was doing that with Van Jefferson. Like he was a guy a couple years ago, everybody wanted to chase because he had a 600-yard season. And I'm like, dude, this doesn't win you anything. He had 800 yards, but I was like, his ceiling is 600 yards because he had a couple of really long plays that season that bumped him to 800. He didn't even reach 600 combined over the last 2 years where I've been kind of hammering him. The point with Miami, and then again, the next player I want to go to is Jonnu Smith, who I think is the best bet to crack into. And then Odell Beckham. The bigger reason that Malik Washington isn't draftable is Odell Beckham's there too. I mean, it's not even a guarantee that it would be Malik Washington next. I referenced Eric Azukama, who was a fourth-round pick for the Dolphins a couple years ago, wide receiver, has done nothing. Malik Washington was a sixth-round pick, and they also brought in Odell Beckham. Like, that's not even a debate. He's not draftable in a concentrated passing game. He would have to be such a hit. You're trying to, and this is another thing we're going to talk to Jacob about. Like you're trying to get him to where there's a contingent-based upside scenario. Maybe Tyreek or Waddle get hurt, and then he gives you that splash game in week 16 or 17. What if he's the guy you need? That's what I loved about the piece that Jacob did, because it really tied into what my intuition was that we're overplaying this concept of what if he's the guy you need, that really you're hurting your advance rate, you're hurting your builds, just trying to throw in a guy who, okay, he's correlated to have a Miami stack. I don't even think you can really like try to bring along Malik Washington for a spike week late. He's that small of a part of the build. And again, we're going to talk to Jacob about this, but what he did research on and showed is that the spike week guys are typically full season hits. I think if you want Malik Washington to be a spike week guy, you want to be able to tell yourself a story that he integrates into the offense in a full season way, that is role strong enough that you could project him in DFS for 6 or 8 targets, or like his DFS salary is high enough and you could project him for 6 or 8 targets that week, or at least it's in the range of outcomes. You could project him for 4. He's going to be projecting for 2 targets. And you're thinking, well, what if he has that spike week? Unless he's a huge rookie hit, which there are hits, but the way that this is so concentrated, even if he's a hit, what do you get when you're right? Is the impact 1,000-yard season? I don't think there's any room for that unless Waddle, or possibly it's Waddle and Tyreek get hurt, not just because of how concentrated it gets when one of them's out on the other guy. When Waddle was out last season, it was just all Tyreek. That's why there was still only a 300-yard player as the third best option in that passing game when those guys both missed time. When Tyreek missed the one game, Waddle got 9 targets, had 140 yards, and was the focal point of the passing game. I went to Jonnu here because people talk about his last season. I want to emphasize that last season, his targets were a career high. His yards were a career high. His receptions were a career high. He was the second tight end in that passing game, and was getting a lot of designed looks from Arthur Smith, a lot of first read type stuff that was frustrating for Kyle Pitts managers. But people overstate what that season was. He signed a huge contract to go to New England and didn't earn volume at all, was not meaningful, was okay in Tennessee early in his career. I liked him. He was efficient at times, but I thought that was because the passing game volume was holding him back. I do just want to emphasize, this is not like a guy who has an extended career of high levels of production. He's never had a 600-yard season. Now he's going to a team where there wasn't a third player on the team that had a 400-yard season last year. Last year was his first 500-yard receiving season for Jonnu Smith. And also, like, people are like, yeah, he took away volume from Kyle Pitts. Kyle Pitts was hurt, but still out-targeted him by 20 and still had more yards than him. I do want to point out, you can hate on Kyle Pitts all you want. And the Jonnu Smith stuff was frustrating. But it's not like Jonnu Smith was actually more productive than Kyle Pitts, which I think that's the other way I think people remember it, is that Jonnu Smith had more production than Pitts. And it's like, no, Pitts was playing injured and did outproduce Jonnu, even on a team and for a coach that was like designing stuff for Jonnu in a way that was not helping their team win. It was what I would argue. I think it was maddening for a reason. It wasn't just for fantasy. It was because it wasn't utilizing their team strengths and their player strengths and the guys that could actually help you win. Although, again, we found out after the season that Pitts was more banged up than we thought. Point I'm emphasizing here on Jonnu is that he's not some type of hidden closet superstar. he would have to be better than he's ever been, and then also reverse the trends in Miami. Go over to his yards per out run profile, targets per out run. He did have a really high targets per out run 1 year in New England, where they had him on pass blocking a ton, and they basically only ran him out on a route when it was like a designed play for him on like a play action throw. So the 150 routes kind of warps this number. That anytime he's had big routes, he's been like decent but not great. If you look at like Durham Smythe last year, the targets per out run were really low, lots of routes. Maybe that's a Durham Smythe problem. I would contend that's probably part of the role, right? For the reasons we're talking about. Miami does RPOs. They get the ball out on a pass plays to the guys they want to get it to. McDaniel's the best in the league at designing plays to get like the play design where he has like Tyreek Hill in motion and then curling up the field to get the free release and then coming back into the deep middle of the field, which Pat Crane has dubbed the splash zone. We know is a high efficiency area. The Dolphins attack that area better than any team in the league. Like he's a mastermind at getting his best players into the spots where they can be most efficient, and defenses are not finding answers. And it's not like they're not trying to. They don't want to give Tyreek Hill 180 targets, but McDaniel knows how to scheme. So is Jonnu Smith going to be an 18% targets per out run guy in this offense? Maybe, because he's shown an ability to actually carry some targets per out run, but on higher route volume than he's ever had, and in an offense that probably suppresses the ancillary target shares. I'm guessing that he doesn't get to even to these types of numbers, that he comes in lower than these types of numbers. Then the other guy we have to talk about here, I got it right, Odell Beckham Jr. Obviously doesn't play in 2022. Last year, he gets his routes cold because he's not getting open enough. He just doesn't look explosive enough. He does have a decent amount of targets per out run at a high ADOT. This weighted targets per out run number is solid. He's actually probably the guy that if anyone has a 600-yard season other than those top two receivers, that it's Beckham. But again, we go back to this sortable thing. I've shown this on other episodes. This is sorted by weighted targets per out run. This column over here on the right of the screen, column N. Tyreek Hill's number 1 in the NFL, and Jalen Waddle's right here. I think it's number 12. I've counted this a few times. It's 11. 11 overall. He's tied with like Nico Collins. He's right behind Keenan Allen and Mike Evans. Strong, dominant number ones in their own offenses. That's the volume that Waddle got per route in an offense where Tyreek Hill was running away from everyone else, all of the other best players in the league in per route volume. So how does the number 2 in that offense also get that much work? Again, it gets back to how good Mike McDaniel is at getting the ball into the best players on his team's hands. It's fantastic to watch. It's why you can't really draft the ancillary Miami players. What are you expecting those guys to do, really? Like I said, Beckham maybe gets a little bit of like veteran deference and maybe has the opportunity to do the most out of that group. And then the running backs we got to talk about. The big thing for me is cost. I want to get to Jacob. He's in the queue here. So I'm going to go through this kind of quick. I've written about it. You can get it over at the Substack, bengretch.substack.com. I wrote about the scenarios around the league that are the most, the potential for like a dream scenario, like an explosive upside, high end, 95th percentile, tail outcome. I wrote about some key spots. One of the ones I emphasized was the Miami run game because of how many touchdowns this team scored last year. One of the things I do with my projections is I look down here at the bottom team total. This is their rushing TDs. This team had 27 rushing TDs last year. That's a ton. 30 pass TDs. It's probably going to shift more towards the pass this year. This is one of the things when you do a projection, you see that it was super balanced like this. It tends to regress, this balance between pass and run TDs. And I don't expect that they'll have 27 rush TDs again, because just to put that in context, most teams don't even have 20. But Mostert had 18 and had 3 receiving TDs and led the NFL with 21 overall touchdowns. Devon Achane had 11 of his own. I mean, that's just insane. That is behind the guy who had 20. There's lead backs who don't hit double-digit TDs, but behind the guy who had 21 TDs is very similar to the Waddle point. Behind Tyreek Hill's massive weighted targets per out run, Jalen Waddle was there with a really high weighted targets per out run. Behind Mostert's 21 TDs, Devon Achane was there with 11, 32 combined for those top two guys. Ahmed adds another 2. You're talking about just really strong running back fantasy scoring in this offense. So either Raheem Mostert is significantly underpriced again. If he stays healthy all year, I would contend if I knew he was playing 17 games, I would draft him in he'd be the best pick in fantasy. I'd draft him in every single league if I knew he would play every game. And I probably am still not taking him enough because he's just significantly underpriced relative to what he did last season. I understand the age concern, but with most age concerns, we're trying to predict if the guy can do something that he did 5 years earlier in his prime when he was 27 or younger. There's not a lot of guys who had their very best season at age 31. I'll go to Mostert's career. I've given the stat before. 21 TDs last year in his entire career down here in the bottom right. 40 career touchdowns. He had 21 last season. It led the NFL. And it was more than he had in his entire career leading into last year. So what is Raheem Mostert's prime? Well, I mean, it's this last season. It was his career high in rushing yards, first 1,000-yard season, most rush attempts in his career, most touches in his career, right? Like, this is the best season Raheem Mostert's ever had. Does that mean that he's not going to hit an age cliff? No, absolutely not. But there is a relevant point that we're not asking him. Like, the age stuff with running backs is once their efficiency starts to go, you get off the cliff. If the guy's playing at this level, he had a 4.8 yards per carry last year. I'm not sure that I want to be certain to get off the cliff, especially when you factor in cost. Everyone is so worried about his age that he's so cheap, considering that he scored as many TDs as he did. The flip side of that is Devon Achane is probably undervalued too, because he had a tremendous season last year. And if the market's telling you that we should be concerned about Raheem Mostert, then Achane's pretty important. And then I've said that Jalen Wright is probably the most valuable handcuff in all of fantasy, because if either of these guys goes down, and Achane missed some time last year too and is a smaller back, you're talking about Wright with his explosiveness, being a similar profile, probably fitting into the equation and getting immediately into a spot where the efficiency is there, the touchdowns are there, there's so much production potential. Jeff Wilson was good last year. I want to emphasize him real quick. 4.6 yards per carry. He was good the year prior in this rushing game. I just did the thing where I opened it in a new tab, I realized. But the year prior, he was at 4.9 overall yards per carry. He had played for both the San Francisco and Miami that season. 4.7 while with Miami. Those are good numbers still. He's still putting up decent numbers. I've been writing him off entirely. Didn't really play a lot last year. It's possible he wins that number 3 job over Jalen Wright or is involved in some way. It's possible he makes the team, right? It complicates things. The other one is Stefon Ahmed, who played a decent amount, 2.8 yards per carry. Ahmed's probably the one that needs to go. I'm kind of wondering if it's going to wind up being Wilson. I think I ended up projecting it as a 4-back system. But the other issue there, I don't know if they'll keep 4 running backs because of Alec Ingold. And this system, coming over from Kyle Shanahan's in San Francisco, does utilize a fullback in the passing game. Ingold got 16 targets last year. There's very few teams that have a fullback that are catching almost a pass a game. He got a couple rush attempts. The year prior for him, it was even bigger, I want to say. When McDaniel took over in Miami, he signed Ingold. So the year prior he had 23 targets here. He signed Ingold to a pretty big fullback contract. I believe it was the second biggest fullback contract in the league, behind only Kyle Juszczyk, his former fullback when he was the coordinator for the Niners. They do want to have a fullback that incorporates into some of the running concepts, and then they use in the passing game a little bit, which can limit the receiving profiles of the running backs. It's kind of an annoyance, although the running backs did get plenty of targets. And Achane, that was what I was trying to emphasize with Achane, is they were throwing to him with intent. Like, they were running him on the little angle routes, and Tua was dumping off to him as a first read. It was coming out quick. It was like, we want to get him the ball in space. Love to see that for his high-value touch ceiling. But yeah, the Ingold element of it is something to consider, whether they'll hold 4 running backs. I'd be curious to get Jacob's take on that, and we'll bring in Jakob now because I've been making him wait for far too long. What's up, buddy? How are you doing?
Hey, how's it going? I'm happy to be here. Talking about Miami running backs. Awesome.
Yeah, you're the guy who was going nuts when Devon Achane landed in Miami.
Oh man, he's
on draft day.
Absolute favorite. Yeah, I mean, I was. Favorite. I was a massive fan of Devon Achane in college, like truly one of my 5 favorite college players, like probably ever. I remember the Achane Spiller wars in the Devi communities for years. So it was fun. I remember that was like the spot that I wanted to be on. I probably spent more time writing about the Miami backfield last year than like maybe all other backfields combined. And then,
so what are your
then
thoughts?
Then they draft probably one of my favorite running backs in this year's class again, and another back that specifically, I remember being in this argument in one of my Discords about what Miami was going to do with the running back position. And a lot of people saying like, oh, like they're fine with Jeff Wilson. Like he had this yards per carry last year. I have my take that like maybe isn't even based in the numbers, but I thought that Jeff Wilson was a pretty material downgrade last year from what they had at the other guys. And specifically, they couldn't run a lot of the same concepts with him because he just doesn't have the juice that they had in those other backs. And one of the like larger trends that I was writing about a lot last year was I thought a lot of the sharper coaches around the league were moving away from complementary backs and moving towards like complementary in the sense of backs who do different things and moving towards backs who were redundant, and not in a bad way, but in a good way, in the way of no matter who we put out there, we can run what we want to run, either as in we can run everything or we can run what we run best. And I mean, I'm nervous that sometimes when I have a take that looks like it might be backed up, that you get overly confident it's correct. So I don't know whether that will be the case. But I wrote specifically about I thought that the Rams and the Dolphins should be teams that should be attacking the running back position, looking at guys that allowed them to hit on redundancy at the position. So specifically with Wright, that was the guy I really wanted Miami to draft because I looked at their team and I thought Mostert and Achane's awesome. That's all they need if both are healthy. They don't need to use any other backs. But Achane's small, got injured a lot last year. Mostert's old, was pretty healthy last year, but that's not really been the case for a lot of his career. One of those guys gets out. I think you want to have a guy that you can run some of those same concepts with. And I don't think you can just go to, either Mostert or Achane and say, here's 90% of the touches over a sustained period of time and think you're going to get the same level of performance out of them and think you're going to get health out of them. So I'm pretty bullish on Wright, like maybe more, especially in Dynasty as a long-term complement to Achane. But in best ball, I've been drafting a lot of him because I think you get an injury from either one of Mostert or Achane, which I think is just likely, right? Like the odds that both of those guys play 17 games, I feel like you should be getting a lot of plus 50 money on that, right? And then I think Wright comes in and has like probably a pretty sizable role. And what I would expect from him is it's a high like touch per snap role and it's a high efficiency role. So I'm pretty excited about Wright for sure. And getting off Miami, but I had a similar take with the Rams, which I thought that McVay had this like existential question where it's like, how are we going to do what we want to do, which is to basically play up tempo, not substitute, not tip our plays, but also not give this undersized back 350 touches this year. And I thought the solve that he found for that was I'm going to draft his literal clone. And then I'm just going to play Kyron 2 drives and Corum 1 drive. And then I don't have to substitute because Corum can play all 3 downs. He can just play like every 3rd or 4th drive and then just be Kyron on that drive and then go back to the bench and then let Kyron play every play on his drive versus what they had to do with Akers, where he had like proficiencies in certain areas and deficiencies specifically as a lockdown and distance player, where they had to go sub him off the field and then bring somebody else back, and they couldn't catch defenses in suboptimal formations when they went back on early downs after converting a third. So that was off topic. You already had mentioned.
No, it was right on topic.
Scared of having me on and being long-winded, and I immediately did that. But yeah, I'm very optimistic about everyone in the Miami backfield.
We've talked about doing a show for a while, and you and I both love to get into the details. Obviously, the listeners of this show enjoy that stuff. They have to, or else they wouldn't be here. That was all incredibly on topic, and you've completely convinced me that Jeff Wilson, I'm probably going to remove him from my. I mean, I think he's still probably the RB4. I don't know. Maybe Ahmed is the RB4.
Yeah, I don't know what his contract situation is, or like how expensive it is to keep him.
Yeah, I don't think I really dug into that either. I was just kind of looking at his efficiency, but I think you made perfect points. Like even when you started that point, my question would have been, okay, but would they just use Jeff Wilson for the things that he's good at? And then you went into a really strong explanation of that. And the Rams point has been discussed a ton, that, Blake Corum does a lot of the exact same things. And McVay has talked about how he does some of the same things, and they were looking for that. But I think that makes perfect sense as far as how Jalen Wright fits. Anyway, yeah, I must have missed that take from you earlier before the draft, but that's a fantastic take. And I think, you said you got to be careful about being too confident when you hit on that take. I think it's a great explanation of what we are seeing, especially within this coaching tree that teams are trying to do. Although it's interesting that Shanahan's not so much into that, or doesn't seem to be, because he keeps trying to hit on the big back.
You need to be if you have Christian McCaffrey. I think that's like.
But why does he keep taking day 2 big backs? Like, why does he take Trey Sermon and then Tyrion Davis-Price?
Yeah, I'm not really sure. Like, I've tried to get in the mind of these coaches sometimes, and sometimes I feel like I have a mind meld with certain coaches where it's like I can kind of predict what they're trying to do when they do things. Kyle Shanahan eludes me, man. I don't know.
Their player personnel stuff. We don't need to dive into their player personnel stuff, because
I don't know what he saw in Trey Sermon. Like, I don't really know what he sees in Isaac. I guess I see what he sees in Isaac Durendo, which is like big guy go fast.
But that was Tyrion Davis-Price, and it was like, but this doesn't really work. I mean, maybe it'll work for Durendo. I don't know, but I just literally did the meme from Arrested Development. Like, it didn't work last time, but maybe it'll work this time.
Right.
I do got to go back.
What if it'll work for us?
What if it'll work for us? I do got to go back to. I got to give the chat some love with some of these more. Remember some guys' names.
Oh boy,
Jacob. We went back to some throwback Dolphins here. If you have any that you remember that you want to mention, feel free to. But Dylan mentions Randy McMichael here. We get we talked about Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. I mentioned Jay Fielder, the ill-fated Dante Culpepper signing, but Alindo Mare, the longtime kicker there. I loved seeing that one. We got Ted Ginn.
You got a Cleo Lemon in the chat yet?
Oh my God, he was bad. He had like 2 starts. He was a quarterback, right?
Yeah, he was.
Is he Canadian or something?
I'm pretty sure he played in the CFL for a hot minute.
I think he played in the CFL. That's right. Yeah,
that's why he's the tip of my tongue. Yeah, I want to say he played for the BC Lions for a little bit. Oh, he played for the Toronto Argonauts. Argonauts, 2010, 2011. There we go.
Nice. Larry Zonko. We got Brian Hartline here, Reggie Bush, Lamar Miller, another good one, Anthony Fasano. We got John Beck and Pat White. You guys had some great ones there. Oh, Devon Bess, the original Jarvis Landry, who we also have a Jarvis Landry. Devon Bess had some.
He was good.
Some good games. We got Consigliere showed up and said,
Wildcat year.
He misspelled your name.
Year, Bess,
he was really bummed that he missed you, but also doesn't know how to spell your name. So that's fantastic.
That's fair.
What were we gonna say? Bess was the guy.
When it's with the K, you will get the U. Like, there's a hockey player in the NHL, or I think he was. I don't think he's in there anymore, but named Jakob Silverberg, and he had the JAKUB action. So it's my parents' fault really for going with the K. Like, people think that it's pronounced Jakob. People think that it has a U in it. Like, it's all sorts of crazy stuff.
So Benjamin was pushing back on. I also like to look at some of these comments that don't necessarily agree with my breakdowns. He was pushing back on some of my comments about the ancillary pieces on Miami. He said, listen to what McDaniel said about Malik in the draft process. Do let NCAA and receptions, as films and say, goes up and gets the ball. That's what McDaniel said about getting Jonnu the ball. And then he adds, I'm also at 0% Hill in 800 drafts, so I'm taking
that's terrifying.
I just showed you the weighted targets per route run of a guy who has smashed in volume and designed volume every other player in the league. You've done 800 drafts and you've taken 0%.
I can't criticize because I have 0% McCaffrey, so I'm not going to knock him.
Woo! That's spicy. I think structurally, though, you can get to a point where you can make a pretty strong case that even if McCaffrey is right, that it's very tough to be right structurally if certain things break, certain ways. And so like you can get out from under that. With Tyreek, it's like it's the right position to be drafting. And if he has a good year, I don't know. I'm not certain that Benjamin's going to regret that, but I'm going through the chat now as well and trying to finish my thought. I'm super good at multitasking. If you haven't checked out the show before, I just wanted to like make sure I didn't miss any like big questions or anything that we maybe should hit on for Miami before we move forward. But I want to get to how you're doing. If you're not subscribed to Jacob's newsletter, Thinking About Thinking, it's one of my absolute favorite pieces of fantasy content. You wrote my favorite piece of fantasy content this offseason so far. I've already referenced it on the show. You broke down multiple things. I went point by point in texting you. I should go through our text messages because that would be the easiest way for me to remember all the things I loved about it. But I went point by point about like multiple things that I thought were some of my favorite things that I had seen. I know one of them immediately. God, our text messages are too long for me to find it. People are not surprised by that.
It's like intermingled between us debating who to draft in like the 6th round of our Dynasty Best Ball.
Right. And then also talking about the Broncos like last round running backs for a long time. I forgot about that conversation, but that's in there. You did the legwork to show that the spike weeks in weeks 15, 16, 17 tend to come from full season hits. And I've kind of alluded to that on the show and talked about it, and I kind of just quickly alluded to it earlier, but this idea that I want it to be late round guys, for me, that I think could be the guy you need. I want it to be late round guys that by the time we get there, their DFS price is higher. And we're talking about them as if they're a meaningful part of their offense, not, oh, he's nothing, and I'm hoping that he just has a bunch of targets in this one game. That's not really how it works. That's a really thin needle to thread, and that's probably sacrificing EV to be trying to make that exact bet just because spike weeks matter in week 17. And you went through and you did the research. Talk about what you did, what you looked at, and what you figured out.
Yeah, so I went through and I just looked at all of the playoff weeks since Best Ball Mania has been a contest. So 12 total weeks. So I mean, it's not a massively expansive sample. I talked a little bit about in the piece of why I only chose those playoff weeks. And it's because I think that there is something unique to those playoff weeks that you wouldn't capture if you just looked at spike weeks all season long, right? You want to be able to recognize that younger players are generally trending up, older players are generally trending down at that time of the year. You're going to have just like more contingent running backs that are paying off at the end of the year because there's been more injuries, all that kind of stuff. So I looked at those 3 weeks, each of the 4 years, and I put the cutoff at 25 points for running backs, wide receivers, 20 points for tight ends, which, a really high bar. Of course, there's impactful weeks that are below that, but I wanted to look at these true, like, guy you need type performances. And I sorted them into buckets, semi-arbitrarily, where basically I looked at, was it like an early round pick who was dominant all year, early round picks who were slightly disappointing, and I used kind of the first 2 rounds for that. Same thing with mid-round picks, same thing with late-round picks, and then just pure contingency guys that like weren't dominant at all throughout that year, but projected to be so in that given week because of an injury. And yeah, the only guy who I would truly describe as like a WTF out of nowhere performance was the KJ Osborne spike week against my Colts in 2022, when they blew like the 100-point lead in the second half. And that was the only guy where it was like, he wasn't very good all year. There was no real reason to expect him to have a big week that week. He just did, kind of randomly. Even other guys that like might be in the KJ Osborne mold, like you think of like Zay Jones had that spike week in his year, Jerick McKinnon, Tyler Higbee did at one point, like kind of more random guys that you wouldn't think of as these breakout archetypes. Like they were actually quite good picks on a sustained basis for that entire year. But other guys that fit into that late round sustained breakout bucket are, the guys you would think of as more traditional breakout bets. Guys like Sam Laporta, Puka Nacua, Kyron Williams, Amon-Ra St. Brown, like the traditional type of bets that you would bet on. And, you think of denominator, right? Like there's just fewer of those types of bets to make. So the fact that you're still getting more of these rookies and second-year players that are accounting for these big spike weeks at the end of the season and sustained breakouts shows from like a rate standpoint that's going to be the higher percentage bet to make at the end. And really all of the other like random guys, the ones who I put in the contingent category, it's running backs, right? It's Jerome Ford because Chubb got hurt. It's Duke Johnson because I don't even know what happened in Miami in 2021 for Duke Johnson to end up getting 25 points, but a lot of things happened. Rex Burkhead, Justin Jackson, Samaje P. Ryan, like second year in the league, Tony Pollard, Jeff Wilson, a lot of these types of guys. So anyway,
it's guys that we were projecting before the week, like I was saying,
right,
could have some potential to be spike weeks that week. It's Puka Nacua last year. You were taking him in the last round, but by the time we got to the end of the season, we knew Puka Nacua was a star.
Yeah, like Amon-Ra St. Brown and Rashad Penny would be like it was a correlated two players who prior to the season were hard to project for all that much, but prior to that week projected really dang well.
Right. They've been crushing for multiple weeks.
The way I phrase it on shows is like, you want to attack the guys that you can envision yourself in week 16, in week 17, going through whatever teams you advance and hoping to see their name, right? You want to be flipping through Underdog being like, man, yes, I really hope I have a Puka Nacua team this week. I really hope that I found a way to squeeze this Amon-Ra St. Brown team through because he's going to be a smash. And it often is those guys. And then you look at, okay, what about the players that were a little bit disappointing that ended up having these big weeks? And this was something that was even more interesting to me is a lot of them are superstars who just happened to have a down year that year, either because they got injured partway through or circumstances went awry. Like, probably the best example from last year's Davante Adams. It wasn't really a quintessential Davante Adams year last year, but he still has an absolutely massive
21 target game. There's certain guys who can have 21 targets in week 17, and Davante Adams falls into that bucket.
Like, unfortunately, because other guys didn't come through for me, I didn't maximum the value of that. But like, I had Davante Adams on my Ball Mania 4 finals team last year. And like, I'm watching this game against the Colts, actively rooting against them for Davante Adams to just eviscerate them repeatedly. And like leading up to that week, like that was the thing I was most excited about. Because I was like, look, if I could go back in time, I probably wouldn't have picked Davante Adams in the slot. But now that we're here and he's on 3% of finals teams and he's indoors against the Colts and he's healthy, like I know he has this game in his bag somewhere.
He had 4 yards the week prior. So to your point, there's only 3% of teams that make it. We had a team over at Ship Chasing, one of our co-managed teams in the NFFC that finished 7th overall in that prime time over there that had Adams, and it had taken the hit the week prior, but then the next week shot way up. Different scenario there because you're doing the whole week 15 to 17 sprint. You were in a situation, as you just described. I didn't realize you had Adams on that team. That's awesome. What happened to the rest of that team? Because you're in a scenario where you're starting from 0 and you have the potential for Adams to just elevate you. And he obviously did. You had a huge lever there.
Yeah, it mostly crumbled at it was like probably 2 things with the issue. One was that all the touchdowns went to Kyron and I had Puka and Stafford. So that was the main problem. Puka getting tackled on the 1 yard line was like
Kyron had
a dark moment in my there was Puka had like a screen that went like 70 yards and he got tackled at the 1 and then Kyron punched it in and I just punched a wall pretty hard at that exchange. It was like a 10-point swing loss for me, and then everyone else that was Kyron was leaping past me. I hated that. And then I just got nothing at running. I had Brees who put up 1 million points, and then I had Gibbs who did basically nothing on that Saturday night game. I had who else? Oh, I had JohnDre Swift who couldn't crack 7 points against the Cardinals, which was
Sean and I had him going into Sunday. We were in second in the FFPC main event, and then Swift and multiple others just had floor games, and it was like, all right, cool, we finished 30th.
Maybe this is even why I'm so tilting Jeff Wilson. I had Jeff Wilson on that team who played a lot because Mostert was out and they were down by 1 million in the fourth quarter. So Jeff Wilson was getting all of these touches in the fourth quarter and got 3 goal line opportunities. Couldn't punch any of them in. And I was losing my mind.
Oh no.
Yeah. So anyway, so I think it finished. It was 40th or 45th or something in that range, but was a fun sweat and fun with Adams. But that's AJ Brown is another one. If people remember, the one really bad year AJ Brown had when he was injured and the offense was pretty non-functional. I forget if it was week 15 or week 16, but there was a Thursday night game against the 49ers when AJ Brown was a game time decision. And then he put up 30 fantasy points. And he was bad for most of that year. Would have been a really low advance rate player, but he's still AJ Brown. He's still a superstar. He still has that capability to come out of nowhere and completely drive your team that week. And so I think that's what you're getting when you're taking these profiles that either have proven to be superstars or have, later in the draft that breakout potential to be superstars, is you're getting access to sustained season-long winners. And in the event things go wrong, it's easy to envision that you have that low advanced rate spike week player in a way that's a little bit more projectable, because you're getting a guy who has that capability inside of him versus hoping you just happen to get like the 1 week out of 30 that like some kind of random route eater, like, oh, I happen to get 2 touchdowns from Brandon Cooks this week. It's like, okay, like that's possible, but it's betting on a pretty thin outcome compared to other options to try and bet on a more sustained breakout.
And this is the article for those of you who aren't subscribed. It's jakobsanderson.substack.com. Jacob with a K and an O, as we learned today. Thinking About Thinking is the name of the Substack. If you're subscribed to my Substack, I have it on my list of like promoted Substacks as well. You can find it there. This is the article, What If He's Not the Guy You Need? It's got, like 4 parts at the beginning. He writes it all professionally. He's a lawyer. That's what you're going to get out of him. No, I'm kidding. I mean, it's a fantastic a piece. Each of these different parts gets into some really important and interesting information. I don't want to give away all of it. I think people should go subscribe. But I loved multiple things. You also talked about the betting on talent stuff. I'm going back to our text messages because I mentioned I'd broken it down. And there's one quote that I shared with you. There's a whole section that you were talking about seeking the full season upside bets, not just for the spike week potential, but because we need to be making bets on guys that absolutely smash. We're looking for outliers, right? You and I have used that term with each other in the past. I had it in an article last year. I think you referenced it in one of your articles or something. But you write here that means making more talent bets and less situational bets, which I think was a very strong, concise way of making that point. Essentially, to get the outlier outcomes, we need efficiency. We need what we just talked about, what Devon Achane did, unprojectable things. The target stuff is projectable, actually. What we need is stuff that gets completely out of the realm of, like, I just wasn't able to project this guy to score 20 touchdowns. Raheem Mostert scores 20 touchdowns. There's no world where I could have projected him to score 20 touchdowns last year. We are looking for and it's the good players who overwhelmingly do that. Sometimes it's the bad players. I mean, like for me, last year at this time, I was saying Kyren Williams was not athletic enough and not good enough to do what he did. And that, buried me to some degree. Although I obviously had a lot of teams that did well. We were just talking about a few of them, but typically speaking, it's efficiency. It's not situation. Kyren is like one of the few counter examples to that, although he also had a decent prospect profile, some stuff that I would argue I missed. But having said that, I think that's another great point that you made, that you don't want to be looking at these like small win situational bets. You want to be taking as many swings at the huge wins that you can have. I don't know. I mean, it's a well stated point. We've talked about it before.
And I think part of it in this environment, like I spent a long part of my piece talking about how people are drafting more efficiently in terms of pricing up these breakout archetypes. But how that's kind of created challenges to, I was going to say what I don't think I'm the only person to coin the term, but the idea of drafting archetypally, right? It used to be a little easier a few years ago to just spend the first few rounds, like first half of your draft, if you pretty much just put the blinders on and you were like, well, I'm just not going to draft the old guys and I'm going to draft all the rookies and I'm going to draft all the second year players. Like you're probably on aggregate hitting better than your competition. A little harder to do when we have, in my opinion, correctly made the youth profiles more uncomfortable to click, right? And a higher opportunity cost. Like Keon Coleman is the guy that I referenced, I think, throughout this piece, is a player who, like, I think it is reasonable that he goes in the 7th round, all things considered, based on we're trying to make big hits. He's in this awesome opportunity. He's a young player. We have a lot of error bars on whatever we think he is. Also, like, I think from a median perspective, I think like the most likely scenario is he's just like not going to be as high scoring of a pick as several of the players going around him this year. He has a pretty problematic prospect profile, rookie, etc. But like, I think it's correct that we're now at a place in the fantasy industry where we can say like, probably you run this season 100 times. I think Curtis Samuel outscores Keon Coleman like in the majority of those. And yet I think Keon Coleman should clearly still be the first one drafted of the two based on what their respective upside profiles are. But when that's the environment we're in, like some of the players, like a Malik Neighbors, I'm drafting a ton of. And I think he's still a good pick at the 2-3 turn. We probably would have got him at the 4-5 turn a few years ago. He can still be a big hit where he's going, but the margin of hit is going to be a little bit smaller when the price is so much higher. The bar on guys like Ladd McConkey, Brian Thomas, Xavier Worthy to be hits is a lot higher when we're now drafting them in the 6th round. And, you know, you might not want to blindly be overweight on all of these guys. Some of them you might even want to fade a little bit or be more even with the field. When that's the case, I think you have fewer opportunities for these wide band players to completely propel your season, that I think it's even more incumbent upon you to not waste any opportunities to take big swings. Like if you have a lower margin of hit on some of these few bets that you're making, you're not able to just click a ton of these rookie bets that are just being given to you. Like I think it's even more of an opportunity cost than when you draft a our favorite guy, Jake Ferguson. Or other players in that realm where you're kind of looking for small wins, because you're probably going to have less access to these big rookie profiles. You're probably going to have a smaller margin of victory on aggregate of these rookie hits that you get because the price is higher. And so I think you need to be even more discerning in terms of, the veteran bets you're making, trying to distinguish between, okay, what are some of these veteran bets that are just like underpriced, that project really well, that project well because they're talented, right? Because they have a long history of earning volume at a high level of being efficient players, versus, well, that guy's just going to be out there. He's going to be out there on the field. So I gotta.
Well, so the one like minor pushback I have is, I think in the piece you said you only have 18 chances to seek these profiles and you should go for them. That's how I played for a lot of years, and I would say that on a lot of the teams where I hit, especially particularly for best ball, solely for best ball, what you're describing is 100% the way that I would advocate redraft and season long in any format where I can actually cut a player that doesn't hit and replace them. But in best ball, and I always credit Mike Leone for this, and it's kind of funny because he's the old guy, or he likes the old guys, right? And it's not really like totally fair, but he is the guy who got me to understand the concept of usable weeks and those things. But I don't think you want to be seeking that too much. I think because the reason I referenced the point where you said you only have 18 opportunities is the way I would argue it, and I think I said it on the Stealing Signals channel before, is like at most you take 4 picks that are some meat and potatoes picks in best ball, where the routes type thing that you just referenced, I think I can justify it. Because I've had the teams where I have too many zeros in a build, and you have like a short-term injury, you have a couple buys, and you're taking zeros because you have Quentin Johnston and you have Marvin Mims, who wasn't playing enough last year, right? Even though he had some hits at certain times, the meat and potatoes guys can build out a best ball group at an individual position. A great name that comes to mind when you said it is Demarcus Robinson, who does not have a long-term profile that's exciting. He was terrible at earning volume in Kansas City. He had a laughably bad 7% targets per out run one season in Kansas City. It's one of the worst targets per out run in a season you'll ever see. Had a nice stretch with Baltimore the year before last. He has a decent little year at the end of the season with the Rams last year. He's not going to put that back up. People referencing his fantasy points in those games are overstating it because he had like 4 straight touchdowns, 4 straight games with a TD. It's more like if you get that many usable weeks all season next year, you'll be happy from him. But because of the situational element that we know that the team really likes to be in 11 personnel and uses one guy a ton in that wide receiver 3 role, and they liked him late because of his run blocking, and they gave him a $4 million contract in the offseason, and all of these situational things I can tell myself where it's like, I get him free at the end of the draft, and I feel like he probably, the way that the market values that type of player, should go in like the 12th round. I mean, there's guys in the 12th round that are like as good as Demarcus Robinson to me in terms of the way that I would project them for fantasy football. I don't think Demarcus Robinson has any real upside, but I do think there are builds when I've built in enough wide receiver upside that has big miss, because it's the wide band players, as you said, where I do want to be a little bit cautious. I don't want to go fully 18 players into that, or at least that's something that I've noticed with builds that have failed in the past, where I've hit on some guys, but it's like you have nothing else in season long. That's fine, because you can pick up Demarcus Robinson, but you can't do it in best ball.
I agree, and I think probably the way I'm actually drafting this is it's probably the area of the draft where I'm being the most discerning, and I don't know, it's probably not any like specific, but probably the area where I'm taking the most swings, or the highest rate of the quote unquote big swings, would be like, or especially at the wide receiver position, would be in sort of the mid-late area. Like I'm drafting tons and tons of Liggett and Polk and Wicks. I don't know if he's the biggest swing in the world, but I think Downs is just really mispriced, and he happens to be young. And then, yeah, that's correct. I don't draft a lot of Pittman. Anyway, and then I would say I'm trying to balance out the early and late. So like if I have a team where I'm drafting like Christian Kirk and Deontay Johnson, I'm probably not drafting Darius Slayton, right? I'm probably drafting Javon Baker or Joe McMillan or whoever else. But if I have a team where I've drafted Rome Odunze and Rashee Rice, like then I am looking at Demarcus Robinson or Darius Slayton or one of these guys, Greg Dortch, one of these guys who is probably more of a small win, but helps get those guys there. So it's maybe not as universal as I put it in that sentence. And like I touched on it a bit in the piece too, but like I am drafting more of the boring good vets than I think I ever have. Like I think I have like 18% like Christian Kirk this year, which is like a very Leone thing to do. I've cooled off a little bit now because his price has risen like a whole round, but I was hammering Chris Godwin when Best Ball Mania first opened, and he was like an early 7th round pick. I think he's in the 5th now.
I should have taken more of him. I'm pretty concerned about Tampa's whole offense kind of regressing, but then I did their projection. I was like, even if I regress their offense without Dave Canales, it's like Chris Godwin was still like mispriced, like you said.
Yeah, and now
he burnt me last year. He's a great example of I have a bad, you and I talked about him last offseason. I was a little too high on him last year.
Well, and I was like, I was probably right on him for the wrong reasons. Like last year, people forget this, but he was going ahead of Mike Evans last year for like the whole idea was like, oh, Baker's going to throw to Godwin, whatever. And then, the offense was great, and he just kind of wasn't. And I think to some degree he was kind of unlucky. If you look at the actual just like per route usage between him and Evans, most of my take early on in this offseason was like, why is there Godwin and Evans have been being drafted in the same round like their entire careers? Like why is there a 5-round split now all of a sudden? Like this kind of makes no sense. It just seemed like a lot of recency bias to me. I was hammering Godwin. Now he goes in the 5th. I'm still pretty off of Evans. There's guys I just like a lot more at that 2-turn, but don't listen to me on Mike Evans. Like there's no player I've been more wrong about more consistently than Mike Evans in his career. So like if I'm fading Mike Evans, you should be getting 30%. Deontay Johnson is another one. I'm just kind of a slappy because I'm always drafting Deontay Johnson. I've been on the right side and the wrong side of Deontay Johnson, but drafting a lot of him again this year.
He's going to rise. I projected him and I had him like up with Christian Kirk and those guys. And I was like, this is what I've been trying to say all offseason.
He would project for like 145 targets, I think.
And I didn't even, I muted it. I got him to like 135, but like he's just been so mispriced all offseason. This, we do got to move on a little bit because I'm going to be starting that projections podcast series that everyone's been asking about with Leone in about an hour and a half. We want to do a fast draft, so we got to get onto that pretty soon. Although I know they can go quicker now. I did tell the chat earlier that I had set up the FantasyLife Best Ball Hub with all of my different formats. So I uploaded data from all the different tournaments that I've done and have my overall exposures in there.
Let's see.
So we can look at those. Now, I didn't even know these. I literally got these done 10 minutes before I went live. I have not looked through them. You can criticize them as much as you would love to.
No, I'm just curious to see where we're most off.
So QB,
you like Worthy a lot more than I do, for sure. But we've discussed
QB,
that before.
I have wound up with a lot of Bo Nix. I've done a lot of super flex. I'm heavily weighted towards super flex at this point, and that's a big part of it. But I'm also taking Bo Nix in all the 1 QB formats too. So that's part of why I have so much of him.
You take Daniel Jones in the 1 QB formats?
I've taken a decent amount of Daniel Jones in the Eliminator and the Marathon stuff. I talked about how he's probably the best pick in those formats. This is interesting that I don't know why my ADP would be so high.
Probably because of Superflex.
Oh, right. Because the Superflex stuff is pulling it down. That's exactly right. I've taken him in a decent amount of Superflex as well. So Superflex because you have other quarterbacks to cover if he doesn't start late. Eliminator because so many people are getting eliminated early that his weekly upside just to get you through is huge because you can get into the money without even winning that thing. I think he's good in that format. And then the Marathon, definitely. The big concern is he could get benched like week 16, but he's going to play like 15 of the games. He's relative to his weekly scoring potential. Any format that puts more weight on the early weeks makes Daniel Jones a target for me. So that's why I have a lot of him because I've done a lot of those formats. A lot of Jaden Daniels, good amount of CJ Stroud. This looks about right. I haven't done a lot. So Aiden O'Connell, you got me in on. We could talk about him a little, although maybe not worth the airspace time. But you did convince me that he's going to start some games this year. These are all super flex teams on Aiden O'Connell. And you see the average ADP, and that's even in super flex. I've been taking him like way after the starters are gone when I need an extra quarterback in super flex builds. And typically when I have Brock Bowers or Devonta Adams, I'm drafting both of those guys. Over at running back, a ton of Bucky.
I would argue in super flex, it's even reasonable to take both Minshew and O'Connell on the same team. You have the extra one to pick with. Like, I think you can, if you want to bet on Bowers being a superstar and you want to say they have a top 5 tight end and a top 5 wide receiver talent in the NFL, and you can just get 2 quarterbacks on Vegas for very minimal investment. Like if you think about it as a trade, right? If you were doing these super flex and you could trade your picks, and someone came to you and you were like, I'll give you my like 11th round pick and 15th round pick for your 4th round pick. Like the person in the 4th would always turn you down, right? That's just like a more valuable amount of draft capital, but you can probably get a similar level of quarterback play to that 4th round pick with just Vegas quarterback. Maybe it's not optimal, but I think the price is so cheap and having that starting quarterback season long is so there. And the situation is like not bad to me that I've done that a couple times when I push it too far and I don't have enough quarterbacks because I do think Minshew starts the season. And I draft a lot of the rookies. Like I draft a lot of McCarthy in May in that Superflex format, who I don't think will start the season. And I don't know. And then sometimes, so I'll add Minshew to kind of get me started. And then sometimes it's like pick 180 and I'm like, well, I'll just grab O'Connell too. Like he'll probably play at the end.
For sure. Chat was saying light mode, so I went trying to figure out where to get dark mode. I haven't done this before on
I got
Fantasy
bad
Life,
news for them because I'm going to be, I assume, doing the screen share for the best ball draft since you're in a best ball no-go zone and I have light mode. So,
I mean, can't you just switch it to dark mode for the stream?
All right. I just did. It's the first draft I've ever done in dark mode.
Bucky Irving. I'm a dark mode slappy. So Bucky Irving was my biggest running back. This is not Jamal Williams, Javonte Williams, and also Estime, who is somebody you and I have talked a bit about.
We both gave Estime as our number 1 riser on ADP chasing, actually.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I listened to your guest spot there, and I was like, hey, someone picked that one already.
I missed that.
Yeah.
But yeah, you guys who are watching the streams have seen my slow picks. You've seen a lot of Kendrick Miller, a lot of Kamani Vidal, a lot of Tyrone Tracy, Marshawn Lloyd, Chase Brown. You know I love the rookies and the second-year guys in the later rounds. A lot of zero RB builds, a lot of exposure to those types. I've taken a decent amount of Roschon and Swift, but also even Herbert. I've talked about liking, frankly, all of the Bears' backfield prices. Jalen Wright we talked about. Have bit the bullet and taken J.K. Dobbins in builds where I need to just be like, maybe this guy can stay healthy. I mean, it's such an opportunity there. there any other interesting stuff? Kind of a little bit light on Jonathan Brooks, probably to where I want to be. A decent amount of Kyron Williams. I'm heavier on Kyron relative to HN than I want to be, but I like both those guys, and that is something I noticed. Brian and Bijan Robinson right next to each other. Got the two B Robinsons.
Hey, we got you on Brian Robinson.
This is going to finish lower than this number for sure.
This.
I don't even know why it's
all of the propaganda that me and Pat have been spouting at you for years. Finally gonna be victorious.
I don't even know why it's at 10%. This is a mistake. There's something wrong with FantasyLife site.
Back, by the way, to the folks out there.
This is an error with the website. Yeah, anyway, I mean, I think that stuff, yeah, see, there's Herbert at 8%, even though I'm overweight on the other guys too. I think this stuff
Brian Robinson
makes a little bit light on McCaffrey. But yeah, this stuff I think, see, HN's only 7%. That's one I want to fix. Intentionally light on Benson. I'm moving Connor up. I want to get more Connor.
I agree. I've also been too light on Connor.
Those are interesting. I haven't even looked at these yet, so I'm very intrigued by it. Very heavy on the KC passing game as a whole. You see both Rashee Rice and Xavier Worthy. Rashee Rice's ADP on average 87. I told you guys, just absolutely hammer him when you could. You can't get him at 87 anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, some of that is the Superflex as well, where he goes later in Superflex is pulling that down. My average isn't that low, but it's definitely going to get some CLV there for sure. Love JSN, Mims. These are guys that are not going to surprise the viewers. Maybe Zay Flowers is going to be a little bit surprising. It's a little surprising to me, but I have been taking a decent amount of him late third, early fourth. I wouldn't expect him to be way ahead of like Tank Dell.
Sean, know you're at 15% Devontae Adams?
Yeah, and I've talked about that. I'm in on that.
For divorce proceedings.
Yeah, he's out on Adams. I'm pretty in on Adams. He of course loves to play the Raiders through Brock Bowers.
Yeah.
Higgins, another guy that I take along with Flowers at that 3-4 turn quite a bit. McCaffrey, a fun late round. Wandale, a fun late round. Obviously got to get my Dunze bags.
Nice.
Jerry Jeudy, I think, is one of the more mispriced guys outside the wide receiver window because I think he should be inside the wide receiver window. He got a $40 million contract after being traded for, and people are like, yeah, he's not actually a starting receiver or something. I don't know. I have questions about the talent, but at this price, when there's not a lot of upside, I take a lot of him.
He's probably not that efficient of a player, and I've probably overrated him in the past, but he puts up like 20% targets per route run pretty much every single year, and probably will again.
For this ADP, you're taking, right? You know the routes are going to be there, and he's probably going to get 20% targets per route, and there's some like just upside in the passing game. What if Deshaun Watson actually does do well this season? You know, it's not our favorite scenario to talk about.
I'm looking at I'm 15% on Jerry Jeudy as well, so pretty
nice. DeMarcus Robinson's here. Devontae Walker, a late round guy. Rondale Moore, a late round guy. I really like to bring Rondale Moore back. If I haven't done any Atlanta stuff on Jaden Daniels stuff, or my heavy Brian Robinson bags, he correlates there as well. Obviously a joke. Not enough Deontay Johnson for as much as I talk about his price, but it's because I'm taking Rashee Rice and JSN so heavily in that, like they have the same ADPs and have.
Yeah.
But I'm still overweight on him comfortably. Started taking more Dortch late. Got to get my share of Waddle. This is Amon-Ra St. Brown, I thought this was AJ Brown for a second. I was like, I'm surprised.
11% Waddle. What? That's got to be the lowest of anyone in our little extended universe here that's been hammering.
I took a ton of him, so I didn't bring in my exposures in my big board stuff and pre-draft. I took a ton of him pre-draft. That's the same issue with Olave. They were like two of my highest players because they were going in the third round, and so then I wind up. I wind up not clicking them as much as I should as their price rises, and I already know I have a lot of bags in the big board, but this will go up. I'm very in on Waddle.
I can bring mine up briefly after, but I got 31% Waddle. So
wow, that's really aggressive. Are you not that in on Neighbors?
I'm very in on Neighbors. I have 20% Neighbors. Those are just the only two guys I take.
So are you not drafting like Achane?
I have 8% Achan. So I'm on the market at Achan. I just have like 0% Evans, 0% Debo.
I don't have those. Do you not have a lot of Diggs?
No, because he's been falling. So I wasn't in on Diggs when he was going next to those guys, but now that he's available in the mid to late third, I'm at 11% Diggs now.
What about Nico?
Nico, I've got to be over on for sure. I'm 15% Nico. Yeah. The Waddle thing is, so I take Waddle. So Waddle for a while was going in the mid third. When he was going in the mid third, I had like 80% Jalen Waddle. And then he's just been coming down since. But I will also take him sometimes like way ahead of ADP. So like I'll do one team that I kind of enjoyed doing. I did a whole piece if people want to check it out on drafting at the 112. And I do some funky things at the 112 because I don't really like the options available. I don't think it's a good pick slot. And I want to kind of come up with some unique pairings and correlation. One of my favorite things to do is to draft Nico and Waddle at the 1-2 turn. They play each other in the playoffs. And then you also set up where you might be able to even double tap Diggs Dell and get the triple stack for Houston. If you go Nico at the 1-2 turn.
Yeah, I like that article and that take. That's the fun one.
And so I have a lot of Waddle at like weird places. Like I have, it probably balances out to similar to his ADP because I was getting really good CLV before he rose, but then I also just take him like indiscriminately. I mean, I think in my rankings, I have Waddle like 11th overall. So
this is a disaster. CeeDee Lamb, who I talked about this earlier on the stream, but once I got through the projections, I actually felt comfortable with him ahead of Tyreek, but I was taking Tyreek ahead of Lamb early. Part of the stuff, as you were talking about Waddle's price moving, is that since I do all my slows in batches, I think my first batch, I didn't take a lot of him because I had just taken him a bunch in the big board. I think my second batch, by the time I was getting into those areas, he was going ahead of ADP at that time, right? And then I just like, it's one of those things where like, because I'm not drafting every day, I'm not in the second round every day. Anyway, I want to get more Waddle, and I will make that an intent. Lamb isn't something I can intentionally do a lot of. I'm going to have to take him 101 because I have taken enough Tyreek Hill over him in the early going that now Lamb is light. AJ Brown is also light. That's more intentional because of the Garrett Wilson and wanting to stay at least even on Puka, which I noticed I was on this last page. I'm at 9%, but I want to be over intentionally on Garrett Wilson, who has for a first round pick, I'm at 21%, and I'm very, very comfortable with that.
I think you might even have me beat. What am I? Yeah, I'm 17%. I thought that was a lot of a first round pick, but
you thought. But yeah, that's the receivers. Let's look at tight ends real quick, and then we'll get into a draft. George Kittle is at the top overall. Brock Bowers, I started to.
That's the number. That's the number I need to get up. I was being kind of Bowers keeps getting sniped right in front of me, and at some point I need to just like be an alpha and start drafting him ahead of ADP and be a little bit more like how I actually believe.
For sure. That's what, eventually Sean definitely got me into where I was like, all right, I'm just going to start taking him ahead of ADP. Every time I don't get two elite tight ends, I'm just going to take Bowers as my second tight end. And like, I have no problem taking him as a second tight end. I do think it's a year to have a lot of exposure to the elites. We've talked about this on the show a ton. The listeners will not be surprised by that, but that's why you see Kittle, Bowers, McBride, Pitts, Kincaid, and Laporta as my top guys. Laporta is a little interesting to me. What were we going to say?
This makes a lot of sense because I was curious when you were talking about Jonnu being undraftable. I was like, well, then what round 18 tight end is draftable? But you're just not drafting round 18 tight ends. You're taking two of the top tight ends.
Right. I've started to take some Juwan Johnson as he's fallen. Ben Sinnott, got a little bit of him. I got a little bit of Cole Kmet. Those are not around 18 guys, obviously. Even the ones in here, it's Njoku and Schultz. He's a stack candidate in a lot of cases. I don't try to take a ton of Schultz, but he does kind of also fall as like one of the last interesting profiles and some stack elements there. I want more Kelsey. I had a lot of Kelsey in the big board. He was one of the first ADPs that stood out to me, and now I'm light. Laporta's higher, I was saying, than I expected him to be. He's one that I think is relatively easy to pass on for this group. I'm not super, super high on Andrews. And so I'm comfortable with him at 11%, even like I'm still overweight. He's just not my favorite play of the elites. Let's see the other late rounds. Mayer, I've taken in Superflex. I've done the late round stuff more in Superflex. And so I'll stack him with O'Connell as a back stack. When you guys saw I had a lot of O'Connell. Fant is my favorite late tight end. I have not taken, I took a ton more of him in the big board and stuff. He's my absolute favorite of that to answer that question. The rest of these, like there is a Jonnu Smith share in here or 2 shares or whatever.
So you have drafted Jake Ferguson.
I did that once. I talked to the chat about it in a super flex where I had already taken Prescott and I missed on Lamb and Ferguson was behind ADP and I had to or near ADP and I had to ask myself if I was going to pass on the correlation aspect as well. And I was like, all right, this is reasonable. I guess the spot where you take Ferguson. And then I talked through it. I actually did a whole thing on the last show where the worst part about slow drafts is when you make a pick that you're trying it out just to see, how it feels, and then you hate it, and then the whole rest, every other round for like 2 weeks, you have to see that player in your build. God, it pissed me off to draft the rest of that team, and it's completely out of sight, out of mind. I have a Dak Prescott, Jake Ferguson stack on one super flex team, and I wish I could delete it from my profile and just give them the money. It's not going to win.
That's funny,
but we should do a draft. You've switched to light mode. Do you want to
switch to dark mode?
Dark mode. Do you want to zoom in for me? Oh yeah, you're looking at your exposures too. What do you got for us?
I'll zoom. Oh, I'll just do a very brief overview.
Shitload of Xavier Leggett.
You can see all the Leggett at the top here. 38%.
I kind of like that.
Those are my 2 guys right there.
I'm just always taking running back structurally in those ranges, so I don't have much Polk at all. I have taken Leggett. I like the Leggett profile.
I think you're a little, I think we're playing it a little differently structurally. I'm not drafting a lot of the early running backs. Like I'll go over to running back. You can see where I'm drafting all my running backs. They're all in the same area of the draft. Like Brian Robinson, Jalen Warren, Chase Brown, Tyjae Spears, Javonte Williams, Trey Benson, DeAndre Swift, Tony Pollard. Like those guys are all in that exact same round area. Yep. So I'm going usually 0 or 1 running back through 7. And then I've just hit like 4 running backs in a row, pretty much, pretty consistently in that area. And then by the time that I get to those later rounds, like where you're getting a lot more of the Vidal and the Irving and those guys, that's where I'm drafting all my Leggett and Polk, and Douglas and Baker.
When you do those 4 middle round running backs, do you stop at 5?
It depends on how I've started the draft, but often yes, yeah. Like
I don't. I almost never stop at 5. I think that's. Personally, I think that's a mistake. I think like Pete does it a ton. I think you guys do it too much personally.
So it depends on what I start. Like, so I heard Pat on ADP Chasing was talking, or not on ADP Chasing. It was the rankings pod that they were talking about this and advocating for a more aggressive fragility than I'm comfortable with. Like they were talking about if you draft 1 early, then stop at 4, or if you start drafting in that like round 7 zone, stop at 5. If I'm stopping at 5, it's usually like I'll draft like James Cook is a guy that I draft a lot of. So it would be like if I draft James Cook RB1 and then 4 guys from rounds 7 through 11, that I would consider stopping at 5. But sometimes I don't because I just want to draft Audric Estime on every team. But
right.
But if my first running back is in round 7, then that's almost always going to be a 6 or 7 running back team.
One of the things that has been thrown around a lot, the Hayden Winks tweet from May, where he was like, in all of the BBMs, it's either been optimal or nearly optimal. And he wrote 3 things, and everyone talks about the first 2, but conveniently ignored the third, or at least I feel like that. And I haven't even talked about it. So it's not, maybe no one else is ignoring it. I know I internalized it, and it was 4 or 5 running back receivers through 7 rounds, and everyone's referenced the 4 receivers through 7 rounds. We talk about that ad nauseum. And then it was 5 or 6 receivers through 10 rounds. You got to take another one by the 10th. And so when you're saying you're switching to running back, it almost sounds like you're switching to running back earlier than me, which could be in part because I'm taking the 2 tight end builds early as well.
Yeah.
Like I'm hitting.
I don't do a lot of that, and I'm thinking about trying it more, but I haven't done a lot of it.
Yeah. So maybe I'm doing another receiver in 8 or something to try to get to whatever number through 10. But the third part of Hayden's tweet was 7 or 8 receivers through 18 rounds, which is the whole draft. That it's been either optimal or nearly optimal to have only 7 or 8. Whereas I think because of the early research before wide receiver ADP shifted, which is a really important element, before drafters were drafting as many wide receivers and wide receivers were going so heavy early and all of that stuff, there was some data that showed the hyper-fragile builds, and then like 10 receivers could be very viable.
Yeah, I don't think
that's viable anymore because so many receivers get drafted that the late receivers got a lot worse, or not necessarily not viable. I shouldn't say not viable. But that's the point of the Hayden tweet that I think doesn't get discussed enough, is that stopping at 8 receivers is like, I don't build a lot of 9-10 receiver build. I don't build any. I don't think I've done a single 10 receiver build.
So maybe what's not coming through. So what I'm drafting mostly 3 quarterback builds. So my typical team is either 3-5-8-2 or 3-6-7-2. Those would be the majority of my teams.
Sure.
So I'm not doing, like, I think I did 1 9 wide receiver build recently, and it was where I drafted 3 wide receivers out the gate, and my wide receiver 4 was Josh Downs. I was kind of experimenting with a fun build where I started wide receiver. Then I think I went elite tight end, Anthony Richardson, bunch of running backs, Mitchell, Downs, and then like wide receivers through. For the most part, I'm not doing the 9.
I should say you and I, and even me and Pete, because I don't think he does this a ton either, or because I mentioned him or Pat or whoever else it might be, are probably going to be so much more closely aligned than disagreeing on this. I wasn't trying to like disagree with your take or your structures or anything necessarily, as much as this is a take that's been ruminating for me and I haven't actually said it on the show yet. And so I kind of wanted to dig into it a little bit for the listeners more, that it is something that I consider, and I've gotten questions about my builds, and I don't think I've gone into it enough. The 3-6-7-2 thing is what I do, I think, a lot when I go to the 3 QBs. I have done the 3-5-8-2, and I do some 2-6-8-2. I've been doing some 2 QBs, but I do like getting the 3rd QB as well.
I only do the 5 though if I have a running back that's early, which is kind of weird to talk about James Cook and Travis Etienne as early, but in this environment, I consider that early. Like if my first running back is post James Cook, I'm almost always doing 6. Even
one
if
of the things,
like I've seen some people do the team where it's like Warren, Connor, Robinson, Javonte, Chase Brown, stop. That would not be a stop for me. If those are my 5, I would add a 6th.
One of the things I would say about this is I think for a lot of us, we're trying to figure out how we can draft as few running backs as possible, which sort of makes sense. But
I just agree with that a lot, actually.
Yeah, in the environment we're in, with so many receivers being pushed up, it's also pushed running back values down, which has made the pocket where you're taking a lot of running backs one of the most important pockets to hit a certain direction in all drafts. You do need to be taking running backs in that range. But I would also argue that in the late rounds, compared to like a Leggett or Polk, the rookie running backs are better picks personally for me. They have the potential to be league-winning upside plays. We just saw last year Mostert and Kyron Williams come from that range. In an NFL where there aren't as many defined lead backs, we don't have as many high-end running back picks that we love. There's more ambiguity. Thus, there's more room for a Kyron Williams to come up and take Cam Akers' job. That's going to happen again this year, I think. I want to have a lot of exposure to late-round guys. Like, that's why I take so much Bucky Irving. If I had to pick one spot where I think that's happening, I think Rachaad White is bad, and I think Bucky Irving could actually just take over that backfield more so than I think the market does. I don't think it's likely, but I think it's more possible than his 180 ADP suggests. But so in terms of like where I want to be, like those guys, it's half point PPR is the other element. Those guys can help me at flex if they hit. I do still want adequate receiver depth, which is why I hammer it early. If I want to stop at 8 receivers, I need to have 5 early, right? Like I probably take 5 through 8 rounds more than most people, you know. I probably do 0 running backs through 8 rounds more than most people. But I do think what is the better pick for a build in the later rounds, because of how the receivers are pushed up and the running back value has slidden. Typically, if you're just thinking about it as a flex spot, that extra running back is probably a better pick to be a league-winning hit, right? And I think it's not probably close because it's already that profile position.
Well, I'll even put it, I think the way I see it is maybe even a little bit more simplistic, which is just everyone agrees that purely relative to projectable points, wide receivers overpriced, running backs underpriced, right? Like you're getting probably more points for the running back that you're drafting in a given spot of the draft this year. And we all agree that to a large extent doesn't matter because you still need to have the 3 wide receiver spots. We know everything about wide receiver scarcity. You want to make sure that you're staying ahead of the avalanche, et cetera, et cetera. I agree with all that. All that being said, based on that environment, who's more likely to score more points in a flex spot this year? Probably a running back. So I think you probably just want to draft more of the players
it's
that
a
project
very
to be values.
It's a very 2024 meta take for me. I want to emphasize, and I agree with that. Is a really important caveat. Let's start a draft. The chat's right. We're never going to draft if we don't start one. I have not tried one of the quick timer ones. If you're into that, I think it'd be fun, especially because
we don't need to do the 10 seconds unless you want to. What are those? I don't even know.
We don't need to go. We got enough time to get a little bit of a longer one than that. I got about an hour and 10 minutes before I told Leone I'd be ready to jump on with him. Although
one person in the comments wanted to see the quarterback exposures. It's a lot of Drake May. People
a lot of Drake May.
Surprised by that. I also draft some of the guy that nobody wants to talk about, unfortunately. But yeah.
Who?
Oh, we got the 101 here.
Oh, Deshaun
Watson. Yeah. Look, when you have 31% Jalen Waddle, guys got to do what a guy's got to do.
You are not drafting Christian McCaffrey. You take CeeDee Lamb here.
But I'm only 50% of this team. So I
just found out I'm light on CeeDee Lamb shares. I want to get more CeeDee Lamb builds into my portfolio.
Sweet.
I think we're aligned.
Good. I would say I cycle the 101. So basically the way I look at it is I draft at ADP 2 through 5. And then I just spin a wheel between the 4 for my 101s because then I can just distribute my shares evenly. And then it gives me some interesting builds. Like I'd rather have the occasional Jefferson.
What do you do again in the top 4?
So I draft like when I'm at 2, 3, 4, and 5, I just drafted ADP. My 101s, I figure like I'm going to allocate my 8% evenly. So I draft in equal proportion Lamb, Hill, Chase, and Jefferson at 101.
You take Jefferson 101. It's crazy.
Well,
what's our timer here? Is it 30 seconds? What's our contest here? The Schnauzer?
That's Ball Mania.
Okay, we're doing a BBM draft.
Yeah.
I'm the host of the show, and I know what's going on.
We're doing Best Ball Mania. We've got CeeDee Lamb.
I've had several people reach out to me, by the way, for the listeners and be like, hey, if you want a guest, come on. Jacob, you and I had talked about doing a show for a really long time. I appreciate you being willing to do this. My brother is going to jump on with me at some point this summer and draft a team with me. Sean and I will be doing our pros versus Joe's draft. It won't be an underdog draft on the channel as well at some, that's on Monday, July 22nd, I believe. We'll see a little bit more of this on the channel. Some buddies coming on and then drafting on their account, which is going to be, it's going to be fun, but we start here with CeeDee Lamb. I gotta service the audio listeners throughout as well, Jacob. I love that we're on the turn because it gives us time to kind of just chat and then figure out what we want to do when it gets back to us. There's probably no chance that Waddle gets back, but that's the other guy I'm really
0 chance. Here'd be a question for you. I mean, maybe we shouldn't talk about future names, but so when you do start CeeDee Lamb, I'm gonna guess that you don't take a lot of Saquon Barkley, but do you consider it if you have CeeDee Lamb, just for the correlation?
So the ADP stuff is interesting because I have not been in a position where I've had a CeeDee Lamb team and had Saquon Barkley on the clock because my most recent slows started in I guess earlier June, the last time I started my most recent slows, and that just wasn't happening at that time. Saquon's ADP was still high. Same thing to you saying there's 0 chance Waddle gets to 2-3. The last time I was in the second round, there was a chance Waddle got to 2-3. So I was bummed to hear you say that. I actually thought that was possible. His ADP is 19.8 now. I'm not tracking the daily shifts in ADP as much. It's just when I'm in those ranges. Doesn't surprise me. He was starting to go in the second round
for the last week. So I've been drafting just like an ungodly amount of BBM teams per day. So I feel like Achan had a Barkley. I can tell we're drafting this on stream.
Your idea of a vacation is drafting an ungodly amount of teams. Mine is
I'm also going to the Calgary Stampede tonight. So
I
got cowboy boots yesterday. I'm gonna have to get cowboy to get my cowboy hat back.
What's the Calgary Stampede? Wait, this is a like a rodeo?
Yeah, it's a rodeo in Calgary, which is a
you
city
say like I should know. Why would I know there's a rodeo in Calgary?
Renowned stampede. All right.
No one in America knows there's a stampede in Calgary.
Let's see if anybody in the chat has heard of the Calgary Stampede.
I thought that was a CFL team name, and you were going to a CFL game.
No, I'm going to a rodeo. There's also a lot of concerts and stuff here. So it'll be a good time.
So the move
right.
here is to just take Devonta Smith to get your correlation, and then also take Malik Neighbors, right? That's what I would probably do.
We can do that. Yeah, I think that's.
You
fine.
want to take Saquon Barkley? You're trying
Well,
to
I'm
talk me
definitely
into Saquon Barkley.
no. Let's do the Smith neighbors. Look, I'm totally fine with that.
I think structurally, I really like to get on track with 3 early receivers, and so the Barkley thing you could have talked me into from a correlation standpoint if we didn't have the alternative of Smith, but I mean that makes plenty sense.
Yeah, I've only taken Barkley on Lamb teams this year. So 100% of my Barkley exposure is going to be on CeeDee Lamb teams, and I usually take Smith too. I'll start Lamb, Smith, Barkley. But I love Malik Neighbors. I think 21% Malik Neighbors, so I'm not going to object to a Malik Neighbors pick.
So the chat has zero clue here. Tyler is familiar. He says it's not too different than the Houston Rodeo. Kevin says one of the biggest in the world. Paul's very aware of it, but he's Canadian. We also have Mr. Popinski saying Canada has Cowboys. We have Stephanie thinking that a stampede is like the running with the Bulls. That's where I was at. I thought it's a literal stampede. I'm with you, Steph. And Dylan, like me, also, this is the first place I was at. Thinks the Stampede went undefeated in the CFL last year. I'm pretty sure they did. That's how I remember the CFL season.
So that's why they're named the Calgary Stampeders. That's the CFL team.
That's their name. Okay, the Calgary Stampeders.
But they're named after the Calgary Stampede.
They're named after a rodeo?
Yeah, it's like easily the number one party in all of Canada. Like it's every year on the first 2 weeks of July. It's a 2-week-long rodeo event. There's like concerts every night. People wear cowboy hats. They wear cowboy boots. They go out. They have a good time. I've never been.
This sounds fun.
I've never been. Which is
wow. You call yourself a mid-20s Canadian, and this is your first time going to the biggest party in
I know.
Canada?
I'm very excited. My best friends from Winnipeg have gone each of the last 2 years, and I had to work, and I just had to be left out watching all their fun photos. And this time I'm flying out to meet them, so I'm very, very excited for that. It is. Dylan says it's like the Mardi Gras. It basically is Canada's Mardi Gras. That is like an accurate take.
This isn't that far from me even. So wait, you're originally from Winnipeg,
I'm from Winnipeg originally. Yeah.
Which is on the other side of Calgary from Vancouver, where you currently live, a little closer to me, but like it's not like it's on the opposite side of Canada. How did you never you could have road tripped at various points in your life to Calgary. How have you never made this happen?
Well, so when I lived in Winnipeg, it's the same time as Dolphins Country Fest, which is like a big thing in Manitoba. So I went to that a couple times, and then I just figured, I'd get the Stampede at some point. And then, and it's expensive, and I was like poor when I came out of high school. And now that I started to have money, but then I was working, so then that became the issue.
It's been a goal. It's been a bucket list thing that you just haven't been able to do yet. I got it.
Yeah, but now
comparing it to Mardi Gras. Let's settle down. This is.
I have a couple weeks off between getting called and starting as an associate, so this worked out quite fortunately for me. Rusty, by the way, is on to me. He figured out that I only let you have the neighbors pick so that I could talk you into an Anthony Richardson pick. So that was sharp.
Oh, that's not happening. Anthony Richardson's the worst pick in fantasy football right now. I'm not kidding.
Wow.
I did my projection of him.
We found our major source of disagreement on that.
People are out of their minds with, it's just running upside, and we can just take him at we're not taking him at the 4-5 turn, bro. That's insane.
Well, maybe you aren't. I got my finger on the mouse.
Dude, this thing about just because he has rushing upside, the more that I've dug into this, the more it's not a fun take. The chat is killing me. It's not a fun take. There's obvious upside with his rushing ability, but we'll get into it after this turn.
Okay, what are we gonna do at this turn here? I was really hoping we could do Lamar Andrews, but we can't do that. Well, I was hoping we could do Lamar Andrews, but there's no Andrews. What the hell?
Well, I think Kincaid's kind of a necessity. Like the 6-7 turn could be
Kincaid, but all right, fair enough.
I'll try to talk you into Kincaid later.
Okay, I'm okay with Kincaid because I don't see a better option.
My other pick would be a receiver. If you're
like McLaurin, I guess I don't like
whatever receiver. I mean, I would probably go to Keenan Allen, but
I'm okay with Keenan.
Yeah,
I'd take a decent amount of Keenan. I'm okay with Keenan here.
Yeah, he's a good price at this point. So the Kincaid thing is I'm souring a little bit on Kincaid from where I was earlier, just from the sense that we don't necessarily know it from a talent perspective, and people are the beats are talking about how, and the team is talking about how it's going to be pretty spread. But I do feel like the runway is there for him to get just a ton of volume.
I would think he's very good.
Yeah, if he's not good, then that's a problem, and that's a pretty straightforward conversation. Like if you don't think he has the talent level to break out, then that's an issue for sure.
I'm okay with him here, though. I'm okay with him at this specific. This is a kind of a weird one, but I'm more inclined to take him there than at his ADP, because at his ADP, I can usually just take Kittle and Pitts, who I just like more. But we're not getting Kittle and Pitts here anyway. So this is like a perfectly fine time to mix in Kincaid, where Andrews and McBride are off the board, and then Kittle and Pitts aren't getting back to us. So, and I can very easily see the path in which I'm wrong. Like, as much as he didn't really impress me that much last year, he's a young player, second-year player in an elite environment with no surrounding talent. Right. Like, if I'm even just like 20% underestimating the talent, then he can bury
structurally
me.
speaking,
and I structurally want to be in on elite. Yeah. Like it would be. I don't want to be so hubristic about my talent take on a player with a 1-year sample that I'm saying like this is the year we have to be prioritizing elite tight end, but I didn't draft any Dalton Kincaid because I was too confident. So I'll be at like probably 8% Kincaid, and it'll be in teams like this.
So the A. Richardson worst pick on the board take was an intentional hyperbole, but I didn't want to get stuck.
We'll get back.
So we got to explain this. The chat is going nuts. They're saying I'm going to get buried. They want us to talk through it.
I don't know if you know this, but I have him ranked as my number 1 overall quarterback this year. So I could not be more opposed to you. He's my number 3 exposure quarterback. I think he's going to light the world on fire.
You have him ranked number 1.
I think he is very underrated as a passer. I felt that way about him as a prospect even before he got drafted to the Colts. I was like beyond ecstatic when the Colts took him. I think that he struggles with short and intermediate accuracy, which doesn't really matter because it's not going to be part of the game plan. Like our short and intermediate passing game is going to be Taylor running and Richardson running on zone read. And what Richardson's going to be asked to do beyond running a ton is throwing deep balls. And they have now a massive size threat in Pittman. They have an elite deep threat potentially in A.D. Mitchell. And then they have Josh Downs, who's a really phenomenal downfield receiver out of the slot. I think that they're going to also play at a ridiculously high pace. They play in a division in which every offense is better than its corresponding defense, and they play indoors. And they have, in my opinion, one of the most brilliant offensive play callers in the league. And you've mentioned how a lot of these rushing quarterbacks, you get their peak rushing season early in their career in their first couple of years. I think that they're going to be able to blend a really, really strong offensive environment with a player that I think is underrated as an intermediate to deep thrower and weapons that really fit what he wants to do. And an offense is going to be brilliantly schemed. I don't know about his health. Like, I'm very nervous about his health, but I think for as many games as he plays this year, he's going to be absolutely unreal for fantasy this year. You look at play volume, right? Like they're gonna lead the league in plays per game, I think, this year.
They're not, and they're not going to be close.
Does not.
And I'm going to make that case after our next turn.
Okay, we'll talk about that. I think they're going to run at an extraordinarily high pace, and Richardson doesn't take any sacks. So any play that he touches the ball is going to be incompletions, runs, or completions, which I think, and I think they're going to have a hell of a lot of touchdowns. I don't think you're going to be able to fade Anthony Richardson this year.
I made a case about him I talked through a little bit earlier on the show, been doing my projections, and talked to Siegel on Stealing Bananas this week, and was surprised that even in my projections, where my running quarterbacks tend to come out incredibly hot, that Richardson came out behind like Brock Purdy and Jordan Love and some of those guys. I'll talk through that in a minute because we're about to be on the clock. Okay. But I'll talk through why and the assumptions that I made in my projections and some of the things that, because I don't disagree. Ken Walker goes. You were hoping he would slide to us. See, so we already have the 4 receiver. I'm really comfortable taking 2 more. This is a room that's giving them to us. Yeah. It feels like Deontay and JSN.
We already have Keenan here. I wanted to get the double Seattle correlation, but JSN is, I think, a must. I'm just trying to figure out who we want for our other pick here.
I think it's probably Deontay.
Correlated play. Yeah, so I'm totally fine with Deontay. I mean, I love Deontay. The only thing I would present would be we already have 5 receivers. Like, would this not be the spot to take a slightly bigger swing on the 6th receiver than we would with Deontay Johnson?
Oh, got it. Yeah, the type of receiver. That's fair. Well, then I mean, then I think the pick is like David Montgomery. No, okay. I would be like David Montgomery or Evan Ingram for me.
Okay, then I like Deontay more than David Montgomery and Evan Ingram then.
Okay. Let's do that. I mean, I think we can go away from receiver for a really long time now.
For sure we can. Yeah.
So everything you said, I agree with. I think Shane Steichen, or I mean, they're not obviously everything, but a lot of the assumptions you're making, I don't reject. They're there in the data. They're real. Shane Steichen's pace is real. His rookie year with Justin Herbert, he ran an incredibly fast pace. Not quite as fast in his first year with the Eagles with a little bit of a more mobile quarterback. But I did talk through how the pace could be an incredible thing for the Colts last year going into the season. And it was. But it mostly was under Minshew. Their first 5 games, other than the game that Richardson missed, the other 4 games, week 1, they ran a lot of plays. The other 3 games that Richardson started last year were among their lowest play volume games of the year. One of them was an overtime game and was still sub 60 plays. They were fast-paced and pass-heavy in week 1, their first opportunity with Richardson. And then in week 2, he got hurt. When they came back in week 4 and he started and played the whole game, they were a minus 21% pass rate over expected, incredibly slow-paced, incredibly run-heavy. In week 5, when he got hurt for good, they were again minus, I think, 12% pass rate over expected. And then the very next week, they went back to a really fast-paced 75-play game. They had an 84-play game in the one start in week 3 where Minshew took over. It was actually like, if you look at their plays per game during that stretch, it looks to me like Steichen's like, when I have Richardson in, I want to almost hide him a little bit because he's getting himself killed out here. I want to play a little slower and I want to play a little run heavier. It's a very small sample. I want to be clear about that. But when Minshew takes over in week 3, he goes to what he wants to do. He goes super fast pace and it shoots up. And in week 6, same thing. And the rest of the year, for the most part, that's not the only part of it. But when I go into my projections, I'm like, okay, I project them for about league average play volume. I didn't project them for league high, and I didn't project them for league low, but I was like, okay, I can't project them for elite upside when multiple of his starts were below average. And I'm a little bit concerned that this is going to be a very run-heavy offense. We're not concerned, but it's going to keep the clock running, and it's going to limit play volume in that regard too. Even if their pace is up, their play volume would be expected to be a little bit slower. So that's the first part. The second part of it is you start to go into, it's a very small sample. We start to go into his rushing numbers. They were fantastic in a couple of games. 4 rushing TDs. He played about 2 2/3 games, really efficient, all of that stuff. But if you look at his scramble rate, I put it very similar to a lot of the other young quarterbacks. Talked through this a little bit more in depth on Stealing Bananas, but I looked at Kyler's, I looked at Lamar's, I looked at Josh Allen's, Jalen Hurts, all the mobile quarterbacks, and I compared it to those guys early in their careers and put a scramble rate in a position that I thought was comfortable. The design run rate is the really interesting element. It was through the roof last year. It could continue to be through the roof. He also got hurt twice, and they signed Jonathan Taylor to a huge deal. They paid him a ton of money. I think they will do a lot of run-based stuff that uses Richardson's athleticism, but I think it's going to be used like in a read option sense to just give to Taylor more often than to pull for Richardson. The way that I talked through his upside on Bananas was that if I'm wrong here, it's going to be because of rushing TDs, but I'm only projecting like 6.5 rushing TDs because I don't think they're going to give him a ton of design stuff in the red zone when he literally got a concussion on a touchdown run crossing into the end zone last year. It's hard for me. And especially when I compare it to some of the other quarterbacks like Kyler and those guys, the only ones that have the design run rates that get massive are the ones that have the massive rush TD stuff. It's Josh Allen. It's Jalen Hurts. I think if you think they're going to use him like that in the red zone, in the green zone, as their goal line back, then you can project Richardson for where he's going. But I don't think they're going to do that when they have Jonathan Taylor. Then they just paid Jonathan Taylor a ton of money. And I think they might do it on 3rd down, but it's going to be like first and goal from the 4, Jonathan Taylor. 2nd and goal from the 2, Jonathan Taylor. Okay, we didn't score on 3rd down. Maybe they pull and try and run Anthony Richardson to the edge. But I think Jonathan Taylor probably scores on 1st or 2nd down, which creates a little bit of a difficult like thing in Richardson's actual rushing ceiling. What does it actually look like? How dynamic can it be? It's a question I don't think we ask enough with the mobile quarterbacks, and particularly with Richardson, because he's so athletic. I think people think it's just going to be absolutely massive. I don't really see him being like a Lamar Jackson caliber rushing points added type of runner. We're almost back on the clock here, so I'm going to pause for a second.
Okay.
You got Dak in the queue. You like stacking Lamb here. That makes sense.
Yeah, we already have Lamb. We already have Smith. I feel like that's a clear pick. And then we're going to need to start collecting running backs here at some point. Who's your preferred running back? I don't like particularly love either. Like probably Mostert would be my pick, but
that'd probably be my pick too. Yeah. Let's do Mostert. So I got through my projection of Richard, and it was interesting. Part of the reason I got hyped on this take that Richardson's overvalued is that people are dropping CJ Stroud so much because he's a pocket passer. And I'm seeing these comments that those guys can't even be in the same tier.
I take Stroud a lot. Stroud a lot.
That's good. The part of the takes that I'm seeing are that they can't even be in the same tier. And to me, it's this type of an analysis that I'm seeing a lot of where it's like, we're looking at one thing. It's like one issue voters in politics. I know you like to get into the politics analogy sometimes, Jacob. I usually don't, but this is a good example of it. It's like one issue voter for fantasy. Anthony Richardson's a mobile quarterback. CJ Stroud's a drop back passer. Therefore, they can't be in the same tier. They need to be split, and CJ Stroud needs to go 2 rounds lower. I projected CJ Stroud for 5,000 passing yards, and I feel like that's too high. And I tried to look at it more.
Totally reasonable.
But when you have a guy in Nico Collins who had a 3+ yards per out run last year, and Tank Dell had 2+, and you look at what Stefon Diggs has done in his career, you really have to nuke those guys' efficiency to start to get into where, okay, CJ Stroud's not going to have the 5,000 passing yard season. I'm not saying that he's definitely going to do that, but the potential for him to put up massive passing numbers is relevant. I did not project Anthony Richardson for even 4,000 passing yards. And it's for some of the reasons that you said. They're not going to do a lot of the underneath passing. He is going to be asked to throw more vertically, but at a lower rate overall. What's that?
What do you have his rushing yards at projection-wise? And granted, I haven't done projections, so right. I don't I'm trying to figure out what I would have it at, but
yeah. I have his
I did full team by team last year. I don't know if I'll have time this year working full time, but
and this is where I might be wrong. I got his rushing yards to 659. It's meaningfully higher than any of the other running backs or quarterbacks.
And do you project injuries, or is this if he plays 17 games?
It's for 17
if he plays 17, if he contingent on betting on playing 17 games, I would bet
you would take the over.
Just like an ungodly amount of money on the over.
Yeah. That's probably fair. I'm probably not projecting his like yards per carry efficiency high enough, but the rush attempt thing I do think is important. That's why I started talking about the designed ratio. I think people think he's going to run more. Like when I did Trey Lance in that second season, I was projecting him for 150 rush attempts, and I was talking about how projecting a quarterback for 150 rush attempts is kind of scary, and yet like that's where the upside is. I only projected Richardson for 118, which is a lot, but it's also me. I'm projecting Jonathan Taylor for 297. I'm projecting them to be run based through Taylor, and then Richardson off of that. So 118 rush attempts is still a lot. And then I have him at like 5.6 yards per carry. Maybe I need to get him up over 6 yards per carry, Richardson. Because he probably have some big runs that pull up.
It's very difficult. It's very difficult to project, right? There's a lot of error bars in it. And for the record, like the QB1 overall is like more of like a hot take. Like I obviously don't have like, I don't think you should like draft him ahead of Josh Allen. That's like an insane thing to do. His ADP is way behind. But it's very difficult to project. Last year, he only has 2 full games. He has 10 carries in both of those games. A lot of the stuff that they did with him was pretty innovative. And I would push back on what you're talking about at the goal line. It is difficult because we had like 1 quarter of him and Taylor playing together. So it's very hard to know exactly what they would do in a world if they had both of them. But like some of the QB power action and stuff that they were running was very intentional, where like it wasn't like they were just like, oh, let's do a QB1. Like they had really innovative designs of how we're going to use Richardson as a goal line threat and how we're going to come out of formations to set that up. Like I can't imagine them going away with that from that. Like to me, Steichen did this successfully with Hurts. He's pretty involved in who they want to draft. Picks Richardson, I think, with a lot of that stuff in mind. It's really exciting those first 2 weeks.
I would definitely be a Chase Brown pick here as my primary. Oh, we could do Caleb Williams too, because
no problem
we
with
have
Chase Brown. And then should we do Caleb and Chase here?
Well, they're the same buy.
Kind
of a 2 QB build, but we could still just do those two and then
who else would
we
could
backdoor.
It would have to
Bryce
be Bryce
Young.
or Gino
or Daniel Jones, who will be playing in week 7.
I
don't know about that.
Okay,
it gives us another
options. Like I guess we could take Zeke, but that feels pretty gross. Although a decent fit for the team.
Tight end? Did Bowers go?
Oh, a long time ago. Yeah, we're 24 picks from. He wasn't even there at our last turn.
We could. Oh yeah.
We could do. We don't really need another receiver. 5 seconds.
Do Caleb. I think it's got to be Caleb. I don't like the buy thing, but it's going to be unique.
Oh, he was highest in ADP anyway.
Caleb. You do not have feet overs at nimble fingers. You should have just started.
I do not. I had not have nimble fingers. He was the highest in ADP regardless, so we're good.
So,
and I knew that all along.
As you started saying that, I was like, yes, this is where I think I could be wrong. And I said this in my Stealing Bananas take. It's a little bit of a hot take for me to say he's the most overvalued player too. There's no possible way he could be the most overvalued player because I absolutely recognize that the profile can break fantasy football. So I want to be clear that was an exaggeration. The rushing TDs is the point that I made on Stealing Bananas that I could be wrong on. The thing where I want to push back on you now is I base my overall team TDs on the market's expectation for overall scoring. So Jalen Hurts can run for 15 touchdowns because the Eagles are a top scoring team in the NFL.
So what you're boxing me into is you're boxing the Colts fan into a take that the Colts are going to be better than everyone thinks, which is probably that's
where we have to get to because the audience needs to understand this too. My numbers go to a solid expected, in fact, a little bit better than I'm projecting other teams relative to their expected touchdowns and meaningfully. I have them as well. This also hurts Richardson in other ways, but I have them split toward a heavy rush TD lean for the reasons that we're talking about. So I have 21 pass TDs is very low and basically 21 rush TDs, 20.6. I have Jonathan Taylor for 11 of those, 11.3. And then I have 6.5 for Anthony Richardson. Maybe I should have those even. Should I have those both at 8? Is that?
Wait, so you have 21 total rushing touchdowns, and how many of them are going to Taylor and Richardson?
20.6, 11.3 for Taylor, 6.5 for Richardson. That's 19.8. So there's, or no, that's 8. That's 17.8. I have Trey Sermon projected for the number 2 role, and whatever his rush TD rate is, it gives him 1.9 rushing TDs.
Okay,
it's
sure.
Probably not going to get that. And then the other 2 backs, actually, Tyler Goodson and Evan Hull, project for 0.9 TDs. So that's where you're getting the rest of the TDs.
All right, that's fine. Yeah.
They combine for 0.9. So there's like 3 other rushing TDs. Although probably this is a team where the other running backs won't get 3 other rushing TDs. It'll be Taylor or Richardson. I think that's probably fair. So maybe those 3 TDs could just all go towards Richardson's ledger, and he could have 8 rushing TDs or 9 rushing TDs even. And maybe I'm way low on the rush yards as well, but the rush attempts part of it is tricky for me where, again, I do think Steichen's – I worry that he's going to want to be run-based, but also not want to put Richardson into too much damage. I think this is like – I kind of feel like this offense is going to be boring Jonathan Taylor-based. Somebody in the chat said, based on this, you should have JT above Gibbs. I mean, I might be headed that way. I don't know exactly where my projections are going to come out or what I think, but I definitely left this projection higher on JT than I started it. That's for sure.
I mean, it'll shock people to know that I'm bullish on Jonathan Taylor also. I'm very bullish on this offense. I'm not necessarily bullish on like the team win total because the defense is horrible and I'm pretty bullish on this division as a whole. But my bullishness on the other members of this division also make me more bullish on the Colts offense from a fantasy perspective. One thing that I've heard a lot of people say this offseason is people will be like, man, like Gardner Minshew was pretty good last year. And to me, that is like purely a Steichen point.
As
someone who watched every play of the Colts last year, Gardner Minshew sucked ass. Like he was not good.
I wouldn't go that far, but all right.
I would. I like, there were certain games, and I expect the same thing with Richardson. There were certain games where Minshew would come out and look baseline competent, and they would play pretty balanced, and they would have a pretty full suite of plays. And other games, like specifically the New England game comes to mind. The virtual playoff game against the Texans comes to mind, where Minshew was like incapable of playing football, and Steichen had to be like, all right, how can I run the ball 80% of the time, but make it cool? And like they were running wham, they were running trap, like they were doing all sorts of crazy formation stuff to try and manufacture an efficient run game against a team that knew they had to run because their quarterback couldn't complete a forward pass. I think that is like the floor for Richardson. I really don't think that he can be much worse than that. And I also then am independently a bit bullish on Richardson being underrated as a prospect in terms of, I think people like I've heard. Wow, we're gonna be back on the clock again, so we'll continue shortly.
I want to hear this point because I do think it's a big part of our disagreement. Where I'm more concerned about his profile as a passer and those things. Komet makes a lot of sense there.
Oh my God, I've never picked Eckler this whole year, but he's like so far past ADP. I'm kind of considering it. I'm also fine with Wright, or would be fine with Vidal. What do you like here?
Well, we already have Mostert. I think you can take Mostert and Wright together. I don't love it as two of our top 3 running backs. I definitely take Vidal here a lot, but I mean,
do you agree with Komet as well?
Yeah, let's take Komet. Yeah,
okay.
Let's take Komet.
I'll just let it run out on him.
Are you sure he's a top in the queue? Oh yeah, you have him in the queue. I mean, I was thinking by ADP. The Eckler point is like somewhat valid. This dude, like, what if he just had one injury plagued year? He led the NFL in TDs at 2 years prior. Like, he's not like a bad player all of a sudden. If Washington's offense is a little interesting, I think his price is going to be cheap.
This would be my first Eckler share. I wouldn't mind getting him as the RB3, 16 picks passes ADP.
It's my first Eckler share too, but I have talked about him on multiple streams as if I should be willing to take him in this spot. Like, I'm not this certain that he's terrible at this point.
At the very least, he's going to have our role. And on this team, a running back having our role is probably pretty helpful considering we only have Mostert and Chase Brown. So that's not a bad thing there. So with Richardson, one thing that I've heard a lot from you and Sean, I love the podcasts, obviously, is the idea of like Jaden Daniels and Anthony Richardson, and Jaden Daniels being a vastly superior passing profile. And I mean, unequivocally true that Daniels' season versus Richardson's pre-draft season are in different stratospheres. I do think with quarterbacks, it's very difficult when we're talking about comparing Richardson's first season as a starter in college versus Daniels' 5th. And, using that as a reasonable comparison. Like, Richardson is still a younger player than Jaden Daniels is today. I think a lot of the NFL level evaluation of quarterbacks is based on traits rather than on the production elements. And, you could argue too much, but you look at guys like Derek Clausen, who does a lot of work on charting quarterbacks, comes away very bullish on Richardson. I'm not going to act like I'm the world's best quarterback scout, but I do think the things that he does well is I think he has far better speed variation on his deep ball and touch on his deep ball than he's given credit for. Some of the throws that he made last year in a limited sample, like there was one where it was in, I think, the Rams game, it might have been the Jaguars game, where he's like rolling out to his right, ends up throwing a complete dot downfield. That's a pretty complex read. I think his feel for the game is underrated. I think that shows up in some of his sack avoidance stats and his pressure to sack ratio in terms of how he's able to recognize the rush, evade it, avoid negative plays. I think that stuff's underrated. I think his one big weakness is short intermediate accuracy. It's indisputably bad. I think there's ways to make up for that.
Let's emphasize this because that's the modern NFL. You have to be able to throw short and intermediate. Like, you can't just hand wave away that part of it. That's a massive concern.
So it is a massive concern, but I think you look at how they want to run their offense. We're going to be a run first offense, and it's going to be with Richardson and it's Taylor. And if you want to play 6 guys in the box against us, we have a top 3 rushing quarterback threat, a top 3 rusher at running back, and in my opinion, like probably a top 3 run game designer. And good luck, because like we're just going to run for 6 yards of carry behind Quentin Nelson if you want to sit back. And you keep doing that, and then eventually, hopefully, you draw the safeties up, into a spot where you're not playing the modern NFL meta, right? If you want to play the modern NFL meta defense against the Colts, you're not going to have a good time because this offensive line is very good. The run game is going to be absolutely elite. And I think you're drawing the defense up to play a different way. What Steichen does so well is like he's one of the least rigid coaches, in my opinion, in the league, where if he goes into a certain matchup, he will change on a dime, week to week, how he wants to attack a given defense based on the matchup. And then even in game, like there's been games where a team will play back more than they should. Like the Steelers game is a great example last year. They ran the ball 13 times in a row. And they didn't come out of that game and say, like, we're going to run the ball all the time. It was just Minshew wasn't playing well. They couldn't stop the run game. And they just had a driver. They're like, all right, we'll just run it. We'll literally just call the same play repeatedly until you stop it. And he's one of the coaches that's willing to do that. I think that they're going to find ways to exploit defenses. I think they're going to find ways to lighten up the back end for Richardson to take advantage of his deep passing ability. And I mean, the correlation on fantasy scoring at quarterback, stronger than anything else, is touchdowns, right? Touchdowns combined, passing and rushing.
Sure.
To fantasy points, it's the strongest single correlation.
Which is I'm part of the problem here. Indianapolis is projected underrated. To score. That's right. One of the major
and my bet is that that's incorrect. Okay. My bet is that the Colts are going to score a lot more than Vegas.
I don't think most people drafting Richardson are thinking through it to that level. I don't think most people drafting Richardson are as bullish on the Colts as you. I think they just think Richardson's profile plays up. The reason I mean, this thing here, that the Consigliere says that he put my take on the Swolecast. I'm sure it was this take that he's the most overdrafted thing, which I've now said 4 times. I don't actually want to be held to account on. So thanks for taking that to a different stream without context. Pretty douchey move, honestly, if I can be perfectly blunt with you.
We're on the clock, by the way.
Okay, let's make our pick. Bucky Irving for sure.
Yeah, I already put him in the queue there for you. And then what's our other running back pick here? I'm trying to think if we have any correlation anywhere. Chuba, I guess, would be fine.
I think it's probably Algier for me, who I haven't been taking either, but I'm projecting the Rams offense to come over and be this way that Bijan Robinson can have alpha upside. And then Sean said to me when I made that take on Silvinius, what if he gets hurt? Like, isn't Algier a massive contingency play?
Fair. Okay. I've been thinking about it the same way that you were, and I'm taking Algier, but that is a good point.
It's like a really good handcuff if you're going to play it that way. So yeah, I think the Colts upside as an offense is an intriguing question. And if they get to where you're saying that's big, the point that I've been trying to drive home with this projection when it comes out, and I don't think you've really refuted it a ton other than talking about what his upside as a passer could be, but I don't necessarily think that's going to happen right away. And the way you're describing them, maybe.
I can't tell you that he's a good NFL passer today because that would be untrue.
Right. And then the fact that they might not actually throw a ton.
Lamar Jackson didn't throw a ton when he was the QB1 overall in fantasy. He threw for 1 million touchdowns and rushed for a lot of touchdowns because their offense was the best in the NFL.
He had like an 8% passing TD rate. It's completely unsustainable. I mean, it's just not a 9% passing TD rate. And I mean, yeah, you're right. He only threw for 3,100 yards that year. The other reason he was that good, though, and this gets back to our disagreement on the rushing, is he ran for 1,200 yards and 7 touchdowns. And so the 7 touchdowns, this gets back to where I'm projecting rushing for 6.5. The year Lamar ran for 1,200, he ran for 7. Like the 6.5 is not bad, but it does go to emphasize the difference between both Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts ran for 15 last year. So the inside the 10 rushing is massive. You have the potential to run for 15 TDs with those guys, or Lamar Jackson's career high is 7. I think Richardson's going to be more like that. Like he's going to have a solid number of quarterback rushing TDs, but he's not going to have a Josh Allen or Jalen Hurts type inside the 5 rushing role. I don't think that's an unreasonable take. And I do think it's, you can disagree with it. And I've said that's where I would miss on some of the ceiling in my like baseline projection. And I will probably bump this projection up after talking to you. It's interesting to hear how high you are on him and some of the elements of being high on him as a passer. But Lamar had so many rushing yards, and then he had so many pass TDs for his number of attempts. When I say 9% pass TD rate,
it's ridiculous.
In context, 5% is really high. I typically don't project a lot of quarterbacks over 5%. But he was at 9%. That doesn't mean that like Richardson can't have a spike TD rate. And you're right that for quarterbacks to score really well, typically they're spiking a pass TD rate in one way or another. But again, that gets back to the Colts then being a lot better than market expectation, which they might be. I agree with you that Steichen's a really good head coach, but even the way you're describing this offense, I don't think I'm wrong to project his pass yards very low. And that's the part of it where I still get back to, and I want to emphasize
a lot on the pass yards.
I want to get back to, I really want to emphasize to the, at least to the chat, maybe you and I will disagree on it, but where he goes, you don't just get there on rushing value. You can't just get there on rushing alone. You have to have some floor of passing points. To your point on Lamar, he did have a really low passing yardage total, but he threw 36 touchdowns that year. Most of the other years where he hasn't spiked the pass TD rate as much, he hasn't been as dominant of a fantasy player. He's been like the QB4 or QB5 at times. And that's where, like, we're drafting Richardson as if there's no risk to him just being a bust, which there is risk to that side of it as well, or getting hurt again. He got himself hurt. And I mean, I don't want to like be horrible to, injury stuff, but he runs himself into hits. People talk about Jaden Daniels that way. The feel for the game as a rusher is scary for me a little bit. He did run himself into a hit that led to a concussion on TD where he could have avoided the hit. And then he later got injured. Not so much his fault the second time. And no injury is any player's fault. That's why I'm trying to pick my words carefully, but it is important to consider. We're almost back on the clock. So it's, I'm getting a little distracted here, but it's important to consider, how much he's actually going to run and how much they're going to ask him to run and where the floor stuff exists as well. If he does start to, pick up injuries or take too many hits or whatever, what if there's floor to him not being a good enough passer? All of those elements are pretty concerning as well. Anyway, we are on the clock. What do you
so my pitch was going to be that we make our last 3 picks, Nix, Mims, and Estime. We pair that with Chase Brown and we get out of our bye week problem.
Okay, but I think we got to do Nix and Mims first.
Yeah.
And then hope that Estime comes back. If he doesn't, we take a different running back. But yeah, that's right. Sure. I like that. That's a good call. I do a lot of this backdoor. The Mims price is nice. We want to get that 7th receiver on there. It'll be a 3-6-7-2 build. That's a good pitch. I like that a lot.
Meatwad, gonna trigger you. Gretch talking about floor. What happened to the game I love? Yeah.
When was I talking about floor? I've been talking about floor more lately. It feels like what happened. When was I talking about it though? I'm trying to think.
I don't know. Probably. I assume that maybe they're perceiving some of. I assume maybe the perception is that what if Richardson sucks is floor based, but it is in some ways ceiling based. Like I mean Richardson's the floor concern. Oh, the floor concern is probably the injury concern. Is probably what people are taking away with that. I think that if he stays healthy, his floor is high because the rushing does get you a floor. But I agree with you that if it's only rushing yardage base, if it's not a super efficient offense, then you're talking about, a back end QB1 probably, right? Like if you think back to Vince Young is a guy that I go back to as a quarterback who was not good, ran a lot, and could squeeze out back end QB1 performances. Tyrod Taylor, kind of similar to that. You need Richardson to be massive caveat on. Obviously, it would be patently unreasonable to ever project a 9% touchdown rate for anyone. So, want to be clear about that. I do think that the notion of talking about touchdown rate in a vacuum between these rush first quarterbacks versus these passing quarterbacks, I think is a little bit different in the sense of conditional upon A, offense is one of the best in the league, and B, team is run heavy, that quarterback is just always going to necessarily have a high touchdown rate because they're not passing that much between the 20s. And if the team scores 50 plus touchdowns,
I made this case.
We're going to account for a ton of them.
Yeah.
Right.
When
so
Lamar
I'm not saying it's going to be 9%, but if the Colts score 53 touchdowns this year, Richardson's probably going to have a 7% touchdown.
For sure. And the next year, Lamar backed it up with a 6.9%. It's worth noting that since then he's been 4.2, 5.2, 5.3. But the next year, and I agree with this take because I remember I was making this take at that time that because it's a run heavy offense, you can potentially spike the TD rate in the ways that you're saying. You're looking at more efficient passing off of the run based stuff. But to your point, the Colts score 53 touchdowns, then you get there. Like that's the point that I keep coming back to is people are drafting Richardson like the Colts are projected for 50 touchdowns.
Well, you know what? I actually think that they're not. I think that they're drafting because if they were drafting Richardson, or I should say, if they were drafting the Colts like they were projected for 53 touchdowns, then
the Richardson
why are Mitchell and Downs going where they're going?
Yeah. Richardson would be the QB1 or QB2 at that point.
Well, no, sorry. I mean, kind of yes, but I was kind of making a different point, which is like Richardson. I'm making the Richardson case, but I'm not even sure he's close to my favorite Colt. Like, if the Colts hit in the way that I'm saying that they're going to hit, then I think the offense is quite underpriced, with maybe the one exception of Pittman, which
the other way to frame this is that the hype on Richardson's rushing profile is not consistent with the hype on a skill player. Like, what we're saying is the team has to be better. And if the team's better, then the skill players are a value as well. I don't think, if I'm projecting sub 4,000 yards, what I realize is I can't be drafting a lot of Josh Downs. That's another player we can disagree on here. I like Josh Downs a lot, the player. And I was like, man, I realized while doing this, I can't draft a lot of Josh Downs. I'm still going to draft some AD Mitchell because I think the overlapping skill sets, the deep stuff that you were talking about. But Downs, for me, when I got done some projection, I was like, shit, I can't, I can't really be in on him.
Yeah, fair enough. Like, and I think that is coherent. I don't know that the way that the overall rooms are drafting drafting this offense makes a lot of sense. Like, it seems like what they're doing is the way the ADP sets now is the idea that like the Colts are going to be like the 12th best offense in the league. Richardson's going to run for 1,100 yards. And I guess he's going to only throw to Pittman. And like, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Like, I think that the whole offense is undervalued. I could easily be wrong, and I'm a homer. I mean, I would point out that I don't think that like I have a history of just being like constantly high on the Colts. This is like easily the most
I don't think you're being a homer. You're unbiased with your analysis. You're close to the team, so you feel passionate about your take when you feel like the take is right. I totally understand that. And I'm not. I hope I haven't suggested at all, and I'm definitely not in my mind thinking you're just saying this because you're a fan of the team. I think you believe in an analytical perspective, and I think that's a fair take, and it's something that I respect because I respect you as an analyst. So I'm definitely wanting to think through this. The way the market has it, I do think it's Estime. You want Roshan?
No, I want Estime. I just wanted to give you another option there.
Yeah, no. It's Estime for sure. That's a fun team. Before we review it though, let's just finish this. Well, I don't know if we'll ever finish it. The chat. Somebody said I went out and got Chinese food at lunch, and I'm back, and you're still talking about Anthony Richardson.
My favorite was when we first went to talking about Kincaid. There was like comments in the chat being like, "I can't believe you guys aren't going to have this Richardson conversation." And
no, it was coming. It was definitely coming.
We literally, it was very nice that we were on the turn because it gave us like a chance for like one of us to make an argument for 10 minutes. Then we make two picks. Then the other person has to make an argument for 10 minutes.
You make the bull case, then we'll pick. Then I'll make the bear case, then we'll pick.
Also funny, not even Jacob can say anything good about it. And it's
well, this is he was saying he got buried by the Avalanche. I don't know what his screen name is. It's CLN. Oh, there it is. 2013. He's got the AJ Brown team here. AJ Brown. He went Taylor, Pittman, Kirk. He took Anthony Richardson, Jordan Addison. I mean, you didn't get that buried. Evan Ingram, DeAndre Swift.
You got 4 through 6, right? That's whoops.
Where did that team go from there?
We went Ingram, we went Swift. This doesn't look that bad.
Where
did Mitchell and
you're overstating it?
Go? Oh, Mitchell goes at 108 here. Okay, that's a tough scene if you take Richardson and then Mitchell and Downs both go well ahead of ADP. But,
well, he had Pittman and Taylor already.
Okay. Right. I mean, he makes the cry for help on the Avalanche here with Adam Thielen. That's how you know you've been buried by the Avalanche.
Oh,
Thielen and Shark. That's how you build upside into your.
I started to make a case that Thielen might be draftable, by the way, on the recent Stealing Bananas, but then Sean kind of slapped me around on it a little bit, and I lowered my projection mid-recording. That's how that went.
Yeah,
but I projected Deontay Johnson for a ton, and then I'm like, well, I mean, I want to project Xavier Legette for a lot, but Bryce Young was thrown underneath a lot last year, wasn't super vertical. I'm going to project Xavier Legette for as much as I can, but he is a rookie. He's not going to get like 10 targets in week 1 probably as a vertical profile. So is the security blanket that had 135 targets last year, how many fewer is he going to have? I projected him for 95 coming into Stealing Bananas, and at 95, he looks like a value at his cost. And then Sean got me down to like 80. I think I took off 11 targets.
I mean, my only argument against Thielen is that I don't know that he is like a materially different bet than like Slayton, Dortch, Boyd, like guys that will be out there running
Except
routes
that
in the
he
18th.
could literally have 100
obviously.
targets.
I think Dortch could have 100 targets.
Well, the material difference is that he had 135 targets last year. Dortch has not done that.
Right. But they have, I mean,
With
Deontay is just coming in to do the Thielen thing, right? That would be the theory.
Yeah, he is. That's the concern. He's going to play X, and Thielen's the slot, and Deontay's going to win on routes, and Thielen's going to be the outlet and running little curl routes and stuff. But if Deontay doesn't actually win down the field or whatever, is Bryce Young still going to have that security blanket in the offense? And part of Sean's case was like throughout the season, maybe not. Maybe Canales is like, this is the thing that's not working. I also think Thielen just gets deference in the locker room. Like every team he's on, people talk about him favorably. They like him. Right. He's a veteran. They're just trying to set a culture with the new coaching staff. He's probably going to be treated in a way that's like more, the veteran deference thing, right? Like more favorable than his skill set.
He'll probably have like 90% routes week 1. Like I would assume that when they open, it'll be Thielen and Deontay play in 2 wide receiver sets. Leggett plays in 3 wide receiver sets. And then the hope is that changes quickly, that Leggett pushes.
That's what we ended up saying. I think actually I had a quote where I was like, but Sean, even though you've said all this, you got to keep in mind that week 3, Adam Thielen 9 target game is coming. Like it is coming. Like it's not
nine targets, 6 catches, 32 yards.
Right. That's happening in week 3. It's definitely happening in the first month.
For sure it is.
What do we wind up with on this team? Read the listeners the team.
Here we go. So we got, I'll go to the team view. So we have 3 quarterback build: Dak Prescott, Caleb Williams, Bo Nix. You probably in a perfect world scratch Bo Nix for a 7th running back on this team, but we had the bye week issue, and I think it was worthwhile taking.
Yeah, it's like a player take on Caleb Williams. Like we're swinging a little bit. We already had the stack set up.
We had it stacked round after ADP. I think very much worth it. Running back room, we're gonna need to hit, I think, but I like our blend here where we have Mostert, who's just gonna have like a great week 1 role. Eckler sucks, but it's probably gonna have a week 1 role. And then we have swings, right? Like I think Chase Brown and Bucky Irving are a good combination of being legitimate upside swings, who I think just by necessity are also going to have a role based on who they're sharing a backfield with, even if they're not as good as we hope that they are in this team. And then you add, Algier and Estime, who I think both have like a ton of contingent upside in their profile. And, the Denver situation is ambiguous enough that Estime just strikes me as, and I'm sure the people on your stream have heard it all the time that you think he's one of the best picks on the board. I think he's one of the best picks on the board. Wide receiver room fucking rocks. We got CeeDee Lamb. We got Devonta Smith as our bring back in that stack. We got Neighbors. We got Keenan Allen. We got JSN. So that's our Chicago stack there with Keenan and the JSN bring back. We got our guy Deontay. He's going to have 160 targets. And then we got Marvin Mims to add a little bit of youth on the team and a little bit of ADOT on the team after our combined, after our Keenan Deontay boys there. And then we got 2 of my least favorite tight ends in the NFL, Dalton Kincaid and Cole
This probably should have been arguably a 3 tight end build as well. And I think one of the other things we could have done differently with the Bronco thing late is I don't know that we had to go Knicks. I really like the Broncos stuff, but this team already had, like, you don't like the Daniel Jones thing, but Daniel Jones is going to start week 7 when those other guys have a bye. I think it's overstated that how likely he is to get benched. I think that was a certainty with Sean Payton and Russell Wilson last year because Sean Payton came in and was taking over team. He didn't want Russell Wilson. He told us that all offseason. Daboll and Schoen and the current Giants staff signed Daniel Jones, committed to him. They just had a quote today. We didn't pay him $40 million to hand off to a $12 million running back was their quote. They're tied to him. I can't remember who told me this. I think it may have been Sean as well, but whoever it was like, they bench him, they get fired. I think I talked about this with Pat when we were talking through it, but they bench him, they're throwing in the towel on their season, they get fired anyway. So they're not worried about the injury guarantee stuff when it comes to that. They're trying to be competitive. If they're in week 15 and they're, not mathematically eliminated, they're starting Daniel Jones. Like, it's different than where the Broncos weren't mathematically eliminated yet and they benched him. They benched Russell Wilson. Very different in terms of, like, Sean Payton was already turning the page and his future with the team was secure. So I actually think Daniel Jones is especially in spots like this, a reasonable addition to a 3 QB build where he's going to add some upside, some advance rate stuff throughout the year. And then could even help us in like week 15, maybe week 16. Maybe he's not there week 17, but we had other quarterbacks. So anyway, I don't think we had to go
secondary.
What's that?
I said, I hope he is in week 17. He gets the Colts secondary.
Oh, there you go. We got the bring
setup.
Something else I want to
maybe you're like changing my mind in real time on this. I've been very much of the Daniel Jones is not draftable mindset, but this idea of Schoen and Dable's future being tied to Jones, I'm going to start mixing them in.
Yeah, I mean, it's at least intriguing. I don't love the idea that week 17 is probably the week where it goes. Like, even if he gets through week 16, he goes in week 17, and you're like, all right, well, so I'm not like taking him in certainly not taking him in 2 QB builds. I'm still layering in some risk, but in a spot like this, I like him as the QB3. We already had Neighbors. That would have been the point. I want to point out, Consigliere makes some notes about Richardson. My take's very season-long dynasty versus best ball. Can Richardson get 2 rush TDs every week? We're all drafting Richardson for the week 17 line of 235-2, 108-2. That's what we're drafting. Very clearly has weekly upside in this way. He can run for 102, and then if he throws for 2 in the same game, yeah, like that's a freaking smash. He also notes he's drafting A-Rich to win the thing, usually pairs him with Burrow, Tua, Herbert to help get him to the playoffs. That note is where it's really interesting, right? Like that gets back to
that's off to me, in my opinion.
That's off to you.
I don't think that's optimal. I think that then draft Jaden Daniels. I think.
Right. So we're getting back to, I think the chat's starting to actually, and there's some this is my real point about Anthony Richardson's ADP is not that it's the most mispriced one on the board, is that there's disconnect. The way that people think they're playing it is not the same universally. You're playing it through a Colts upside thing. What Consigliere is describing, I would also disagree with. I don't think, we just talked about this earlier in the show. Like, I think you want full season hits. I think if you're taking him as the QB5, he's an advance rate player, not just a ceiling, a spike week guy.
That's just a massive premium in my view to pay for. Right. What if he's the guy you need? Right. And I mean, he could be, but like, you mentioned
too.
Daniel Jones. Daniel Jones could be that in a single game scenario.
This point about the premium to pay.
Drake May could easily be that in a single game scenario.
And this is what we talked about Jake Ferguson. Like, this is what we talk about Jake Ferguson. Like the guy, you can get this profile later. It's the Moneyball line I used when we were talking about Jake Ferguson, where it's like I can get him in the aggregate. I'm not saying that Richardson's specific ceiling is replaceable, and you're not either. But Daniel Jones can be the guy you need. Drake May can be the guy you need. Anthony Richardson can run away and hide and score 50 points. Like that's the real point. He can run for 200 yards.
Once I've drafted Richardson, I'm betting that it's the Anthony Richardson season. It's the year that everyone looks back on 2024. Yeah. And 2024 was the Anthony Richardson season. He's competing for MVP. The Colts win 12 games. Like he's a superstar. He's going 101 in dynasty drafts next year. Like that's to me once you've made the bet on Anthony Richardson, make the bet on Anthony Richardson. I think that like, and that's, even if you're of your persuasion, you might say, well, I'm only going to make that bet on Anthony Richardson on 3% of my teams, but then make the bet on those 3%.
I will make the bet on Anthony Richardson on 3% of my teams. That's a great point. And you know how I'm thinking about it. You know that I am going to play those Anthony Richardson teams into my profile. That's why I immediately corrected myself. And it's not fair to say he's the most mispriced player on the board, because elite upside, he does. I absolutely acknowledge the wide band players that we talked about earlier. He's a rookie. He has the rushing ability. He's hyper athletic. We don't know a lot about his passing. Everything you said about how young he was relative to Jaden Daniels, very well taken on my end. I think it's absolutely possible that he could improve even as a short and mid-range passer. That stuff happens. It happened with Josh Allen, for example. Anthony Richardson could be the next Josh Allen. That's not impossible. But the point you said about paying a premium for it was the point I was trying to drive home at the very beginning when I said his price is wrong. I think people are drafting him where they are, thinking he's different than he is, in like a baseline. And I don't think they know what they're playing. I think the way you just described it is the way that you have to play it. You have to play it like it's the Anthony Richardson season. You're very in on the Colts. You think the Colts are going to score 50 touchdowns. They're going to win 12 games. The market expectations are wrong. You go parlay that with a bet on their win total over right after the draft because you're like, I'm not certain this is the Colts' year. That's the way that you're playing it. If you draft Richardson as the QB5, it is different than situations where other mobile quarterbacks are on teams with more talent around them, a little bit of different scheme stuff, more certainty. The point I did try to drive home about Steichen's pace certainty, I think is too heavily certain by the market. I'm not certain that they're not going to be fast-paced. Like I said, I'm projecting them average, but they pulled back so heavily in week 4 when Richardson made his other start that I think that's a concern. I think people are going to be they're expecting that every Steichen offense has to be top 5 in plays, and I think that is an over exaggeration of the certainty of that. But then other than that, it's this idea of go ahead. I was just going to add that not every mobile quarterback has the same profile, has the same team expectations, all that stuff. In Richardson's case, if you're betting on him being in the MVP discussion, like a lot of guys have been in year 2, it's like Lamar Jackson's year 2. It's like Patrick Mahomes' year 2. We didn't see a lot of Richardson last year, but you're betting him to take off. I'm fine with that. I did that with Trey Lance on a very small sample. I was betting on him heavily, and maybe I'm not as high on Richardson at this cost because I chased Trey Lance up to QB5 that year, and I got bit. That was mostly due to injury, in fairness. But I do think what you're saying is right, that if Richardson's right at QB5 price, it's the Colts going off as a team.
I think that the only thing I was going to push back on, and your point about the pace was actually really sharp in terms of the pace difference between the Richardson games, the Minshew games. My slight micro quibble with that, and I was trying to find it while I was on stream, but I couldn't. I'm pretty positive, and maybe someone will find that I'm incorrect on this, but I don't think that I am, that they're like time on the clock when the ball was snapped was still very, very high in those Richardson games.
Sure.
What contributed to the lower pace in those games was like, and when I say lower pace, I mean like lower play volume.
Yeah.
Was he just played like ass in the Rams game. So they just couldn't sustain drives and stay on the field. So they didn't run a lot of plays. And then B was the run lean. So I think if you're conditional on Richardson playing better, I don't think you have pace concerns in the sense that I think that the obstacle to Richardson play volume getting there in not week 1, but in the Rams game, especially in the snippets of some of the other games, was that they just weren't effective on offense, and thus they could not run a lot of plays. But it wasn't like they were snapping the ball with 4 seconds left. Like that wasn't a thing that was happening. They were playing fast in the like very literal sense. It just wasn't necessarily correlating to play volume because of other factors, like you mentioned, with the running the ball, the clock keeps moving. With they're just not they're going 3 and out, and the Rams have the ball, so we can't run plays because they have the ball. So I think that the pace and I think the pace with Richardson and is Richardson good to me are more one question than 2 questions. That would be the only thing I would say.
That's a great point. I think it's a great point. I wrote that in my notes for my projection, and I wrote it to Sean in an email before we even got on when I was explaining to him some of the things that I learned that I got to while doing the projection. I guess I didn't write in my notes. I just wrote it in the email. So now I got to go find my email because I want to read exactly what I wrote, but it's exactly what you said. I did wind up projecting JT for a huge line, but I found myself leaning away from the Steichen play volume narrative and instead toward a Steichen hides Richardson as a passer projection. And that's, look, I could be wrong on that, but it's what you just said as well. If Richardson's a hit, then that's what my whole projection conversation is wrong. That's why we always talk about don't draft off projections, right? Like that's a baseline outcome. That's one scenario. I'm talking about the assumptions I made for this projection so that you can tell me if you're drafting Richardson, both you, Jacob, and anyone else who's drafting him who's listening, this is why that projection isn't what's going to happen, because there's outliers. Like, again, we're looking for outliers. That's been the kind of the theme of this entire show. And Richardson was a great guy to break into. My projection is a Steichen hides Richardson as a passer projection. He's still too young. He's still too raw. They're run-based. They're slower paced than he wants to play because he feels held back a little bit by what Richardson's able to do as a passer and what defenses are throwing at him and whether he can get through his progressions and all of those things. The development is a multi-year development where you're seeing the upside rather than a 2024 development. And those things are the key elements to the Richardson price. It's fascinating to dig into, again, relative to Stroud. You said you're also in on Stroud, but we brought that up. Stroud's falling. People are saying they're in different tiers. That's where I'm like, they shouldn't be in different tiers.
I think people are being straight goofy with the CJ Stroud stuff, where like sometimes the fantasy community just like, I don't know. So sometimes they get too in on a take that's like usually right, that they wind up just missing what's straight out in front of them. Like this Stroud to me is the ultimate, like, the Bell meme, right?
Yeah.
Where it's like,
it's a great example.
I think you want to be like, I think you want to just be like, I don't know, like this dude's Peyton Manning. Like
an idiot.
I got into this discussion where I literally said, I was like, look at CJ Stroud's year. Like, look at what he did as a rookie versus any other rookie in history. Look at the efficiency that he provided to Noah Brown, who we know sucks, right? Like we have a long history of Noah Brown not being good. He becomes an extremely efficient wide receiver. That's like almost certainly CJ Stroud doing that. Nico Collins, who, I liked more than most people before last season, but even I'm like stunned at how he became like one of the best wide receivers in the NFL last year, like on an efficiency basis. And then Tank Dell was a prospect that most people were pretty indifferent about. Like, look at how he elevated everybody around him. Like, this is like Peyton Manning stuff, right? This is like what Peyton Manning used to do. Is like, oh, who's Austin Collie? Oh, he just had 1,100 yards. Like, who's Blair White? Well, he just had 90 yards this week because he got to run routes with Peyton Manning. Like, and I even said, I was like, if it's like, people are like, well, you can't have this level of production if you don't run. I was like, I'm pretty sure if we just got like 28-year-old Peyton Manning dropped into the NFL this year, like I think he would score a lot of fantasy points. He would throw for like 46 touchdowns and it would be at 5,000 yards and it would be fine.
Back to your article, talent over situation. Like good players tilt the field their way. I do have to run. I got to go do the projection pods with Leone here in a few minutes. I shouldn't have scheduled something behind having you on the show because we could have done this for like a 5-hour stream and had an absolute blast doing it. The chat is mentioning people are drafting 3 QBs with AR. I would just go back to like, I mean, I get it. Like, it helps you advance, right? Then you have him as
maybe because everybody has a week 14 bye. That's the issue with the AR.
Yeah, but then also it's like, man, you're sacrificing something when you take him where you take him. You're sacrificing wide receiver upside. That's still an opportunity cost. QB prices got really expensive last year, and they didn't necessarily pay off that. It was better to have been playing later QBs. You got to be right when you take Anthony Richardson, where you take him. Anyway, we had a great talk about Anthony Richardson. The ultimate conclusion was draft CJ Stroud whenever you can. We'll stay undecided on Richardson, but we do agree that Stroud, the fall is silly. Jakob, tell everyone where they can find you, and definitely everybody should be subscribed to the Thinking About Thinking newsletter over at Substack.
Yeah, you can find me on Thinking About Thinking. I have a couple pieces up there now. I'll be writing throughout the summer. I'm going to try and write something out on the plane. I'm going to talk a little bit about diving into that idea of this whole like running back zone, what I think is the best way to structure your team around that. We got into that a little bit. We were talking about like, do you stop at 5? When do you take 6? When do you take 7? I'm going to try and get into some of that in a future piece that I think I'm going to write this weekend probably. Otherwise, if anyone is in the Calgary area, come up and see me. I'll buy you a beer at Stampede. If Ebo Tyler is around, I believe I look pretty good in that cowboy hat. So if you have that to lend me again for this weekend, it'd be much appreciated.
Getting you two together for having me on. Cowboy hats is that's too much. We had that at Vegas last year.
Yeah, I remember that. So thanks a ton for having me on. This was a blast. Hopefully we just won $1 million or whatever it is, the first place with this lovely team. And thanks a lot.
Yeah, that is a fantastic team. I'm pretty excited about that team. Excited to have you back on again another time. We'll definitely have to do it again. Programming note, I mentioned earlier in the show, but for all of you who are still hanging out, I am on vacation next week. You won't see me on the channel for 2 weeks. Also off tomorrow with ship chasing. I will be having the Leone projection pods dropping, as I've been talking about. The Seagull Bananas episodes we recorded yesterday are going to be dropping. I was on with Robert Mays this week on the Athletic Show. That was a really fun conversation. Please check that out. And then we're not doing Chip Chasing tomorrow because of the 4th, but I am going to be back on the 5th with Eric Bimefor over on Spike Week talking about the Eliminator format. So if you want to talk through that. And I saw while we were recording that Calm Kelly, the executive producer of the RotoViz channel, if you want some more of my thoughts on stuff, if you want to hear that Sean Siegel discussion, they're premiering that on YouTube right after this. So that will be jumping on, or maybe it already premiered. Somebody said something about I was on 2 shows at once. So maybe that one was already was live, but that is another one to check out. Appreciate all you guys. Like the video, subscribe, notifications, all that other stuff. Thank you to Jacob for hanging out. This has been Stealing Signals. See ya.